The worst times to be born in human history. You might think you have things pretty hard right now, but if you have a roof over your head, access to clean water and electricity, and people around you that care about you, you've got a lot to be grateful for. A lot of the modern luxuries that we take for granted today didn't even exist 100 years ago, which just makes you think, if almost everything I enjoy right now didn't exist 100 years ago, what did life look like 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? Well, in this video, we are going to dive into all the worst time periods to ever be born into. Everybody knows that the Roman Empire fell, but not many people talk about the time between the Roman Empire falling and the beginning of the Middle Ages. This period of time is referred to as the Late Antiquity, and it is a major time of political instability and a huge power shift in global politics at the time. Late Antiquity typically refers to anywhere from 200 AD to 700 AD, but for this section specifically, I'm going to be focusing on like 450 AD to 700 AD, because following the official end of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, a lot of things continued to happen and change until the end of the Late Antiquity in the beginning of the Middle Ages. Whenever there is a large change in almost any aspect of life, there is growing pains associated with it, because change is scary and difficult. And in the context of the Late Antiquity, anybody living in the Roman Empire was experiencing a huge cultural, political, and spiritual shift that had not been seen realistically for hundreds of years. This topic is undoubtedly extremely complex and nuanced, but I'm going to do my best to provide as much context as possible to describe why this time period would have sucked to be born and live in. And one of the biggest reasons for a lot of the hardships that people faced during this time was the widespread political instability, specifically because the empire that had controlled and mismanaged the entire geographical area for the last hundreds of years was no longer, meaning that by default, there was a power vacuum that people were hungry to fill. And of course, with the fall of one of the most iconic empires of all time, you also lose a lot of long-standing institutions, specifically armies, defense, banking, really anything that provided safety and stability to the people of Rome. Even before the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome was consistently under attack from different groups. But during the Late Antiquity, there was much less resources and manpower to fight off barbarian tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, which meant that these barbarian tribes were extremely motivated because they knew that the big bad Roman Empire was not what it used to be. And what this resulted in was frequent wars, raids, and destruction across all of Europe and the Mediterranean, which for soldiers was devastating because at this point, soldiers were not as well equipped as they used to be, meaning that they were typically at a disadvantage during these attacks. And for civilians, that meant that they were simply less protected, making them vulnerable to barbarian raids, which is something you definitely do not want to be vulnerable to. On top of defenses being diminished and wars and raids being more frequent, there was also a huge economic decline, which was almost perfectly coupled with the political instability. And because of this, massive trade networks shrank. Major culturally significant cities were destroyed and abandoned, and even agriculture was affected due to these consistent invasions. We think about ancient Roman and ancient Greek ruins today as this thing that existed only far in the past, but during the Late Antiquity, major Roman and Greek cities and institutions and buildings that were active and respected only 100 or a few hundred years ago were now in ruins, with the majority of these culturally significant locations either being destroyed in raids, left to rot because there's nobody to use them or maintain them because of the city's depopulation, or if these buildings were still in decent shape in a city that was somewhat populated or repopulating, a lot of these buildings were actually deconstructed from the inside out to be used for new buildings. For example, ceramic and bricks were taken from old antiquity buildings and used to build new churches. The Late Antiquity is an interesting period of history because it is regarded as one of the most transitional periods, as it was at the dawn of the rise of Christianity. And because of that, there was a lot of conflict surrounding other religions in the area. But for that reason, a lot of people see this time period as an opportunity and as something to be celebrated. And while that is definitely something to consider, the Late Antiquity is one of the most significant examples of transitioning from the old world to the new world. And living through that was not easy whatsoever. But in case you're still not convinced that the Late Antiquity is one of the worst times to be born in and alive in, allow me to present one thing I haven't mentioned yet, the Justinianic Plague, which took place during the peak of the Late Antiquity, specifically from 550 AD to 750 AD. And this 200-year period saw a drastic decline due to this plague that took place all across the Mediterranean and was responsible for the death of tens of millions of people. This plague was happening while all of this political uncertainty was happening, all of these wars and raids were happening, all of the economic decline was happening, and all of the religious chaos was happening. All of this at the same time as a deadly plague. So yeah, the Late Antiquity is not just a casual handoff of power or an example of growing pains, and had a lot of horrible things happening at the same time. And for that reason, I thought it was a great candidate for this list. But we have a lot more to discuss, so let's keep going. Following the late antiquity, I want to discuss a period of time that's a bit more modern. What I'm about to discuss isn't necessarily a time period, it's just a stretch of history that you would not want to be born in or live through at all. And this includes anywhere from 1914 to 1945. The first thing you're probably thinking about during this time period is the World Wars. And you're exactly right. World War I took place from 1914 to 1918. And during this time, if you were a healthy adult man, there was an extremely good chance that you were going to be sent into some of the worst hellish conditions ever imaginable. But we're just getting started. Obviously, World War I didn't only affect soldiers, as there was millions of civilian casualties as well. And it's estimated that in total, just from World War I alone, 15 to 22 million people died, with 9 to 11 million of those being military personnel and 6 to 13 million being possible civilian deaths. And that doesn't even account the injured and the displaced. But we're still only getting started. The conditions of World War I were insane. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas. These people did not have a quick and painless death. The people that did die died in some of the worst conditions this world has seen. But to add insult to injury, during 1918, not only was there a massive world war going on, but there was also a huge Spanish flu pandemic. And this pandemic was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. And terrifyingly, sometimes killed young, healthy people in as little as 2 days. It's estimated that the Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people worldwide. Keep in mind, this is after 22 million from the First World War that just happened. Both of these major global events were extremely and almost unspeakably devastating. But we're still not done, because following World War I and following the Spanish flu pandemic, we find ourselves at the end of the 1920s, specifically 1929, when we began a time known as the Great Depression. During the Roaring 20s, most Western countries experienced massive economic prosperity and also had a huge social and cultural change post-war. But this cultural change was for the better, with a vibrant and optimistic outlook on life and the future, and everybody was making money and feeling better, and everything that was horrible and bad was behind us, right? We survived one of the biggest pandemics of all time and one of the worst wars of modern history. Of course we have something to celebrate. The bad times are behind us and everything is better, right? No. And the worst was only yet to come. 1929 was the catalyst of the Great Depression, and the Great Depression lasted through much of the 1930s. The Great Depression can be summarized by its economic, social, and psychological effects that it had on basically all of America. But it wasn't just America that was affected. This was a global economic catastrophe, and millions of lives were changed forever. At its peak in the United States, unemployment rates were as high as 25%. Businesses were closing left, right, and center, banks were failing, and because people lost their jobs, their savings, their livelihoods, and everything that they knew to be normal, people needed to adjust quickly or die. Poverty, hunger, homelessness were all extremely common during the Great Depression, as well as breadlines and soup kitchens, which were basically the government giving you rations of food, which typically weren't enough, but they helped. And it's not hard to believe that with this huge economic collapse came personal and political unease and restlessness. Any social programs that existed were now gone, which meant that the most vulnerable groups in society were now even more vulnerable. Old people, children, disabled people, anybody who wasn't fully and extremely self-reliant was now at risk. But even if you were self-reliant, there was still a huge psychological impact of this entire situation. Just imagine if 5 years ago you're experiencing the most prosperity you had in your life. You survived the plague, you survived the war, you had a business that was successful. It seemed like everything was okay. But then in October of 1929, everything changed. The bank where you stored your millions of dollars was closed. Your money was nowhere to be found. The business that you were operating was now empty because nobody was shopping, and you had to fire all of your employees. The close network of friends that you had around you was now dissipating because people were ditching town to find any sort of opportunity elsewhere. And you are left in a house that you're going to default on with people that you need to take care of, and the only option you really have is to get in the breadline and hope for the best. If nothing else, that's going to do something on your mental health. And we've even seen the effects of people who experienced and survived the Great Depression in future generations. During the Great Depression, people globally were uneasy. Everything that they felt they had worked for was taken from them. It was gone. And now most people are jobless, homeless, or at least hungry. And basically everybody was doing way worse than they were before. And this social unrest led to political unrest, which led to the rise of some pretty crazy ideologies, which brings us to the last thing I want to mention in this period of time during the early 1900s, the Second World War. As I stated earlier, the First World War is one of the most catastrophic things to happen in recent history. And the Second World War, unfortunately, was just as bad as World War I, if not much worse. The Second World War lasted longer, experienced much more death, experienced experienced genocide and so many more horrible things that weren't even possible during the First World War. Just for context, it's estimated that anywhere from 70 to 85 million people died during World War II, and it's believed that almost half of these deaths were civilian deaths, which is extremely upsetting. The Soviet Union alone lost 24 million people in World War II, which is more than all of the people lost in World War I, just for context. And once again, if you were a young, healthy man during this time, there was an extremely good chance that you were about to be exposed to hellish conditions and almost certain death. And if you were just living in Europe or Japan, there was also a good chance that no matter who you were, old, young, man, woman, you could very much so experience horrors beyond your comprehension. And the bookend on this entire period of time is the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima that ended the Second World War and killed around 200,000 people. I just described a handful of some of the most significant historical events in modern history, and all of these things happened in like a 40-year stretch. If you were born in 1898, you could have been old enough to fight at the end of World War I, experience the Spanish flu pandemic, lose all of your money in the Great Depression, and then as an adult fight in World War II as well. And by the time World War II ended, you would be 47 and have a lot of stories to tell. It's honestly just mind-boggling to think about, and for that reason, I knew it was one of the worst time periods to be born into and live in. I wanted to take a quick break from war because we've discussed a lot of it up to this point, so I wanted to talk about the year 536 AD, which is a year that, ironically, has been nominated as the worst year to be alive by Michael McCormick, who is a medieval scholar. And by medieval scholar, I don't mean he was a scholar in medieval times. I mean like he is a modern-day scholar of medieval times. Regardless, what happened in 536 AD? Well, if you paid attention to the first section, a lot, because 536 AD actually does take place during the late antiquity. But I didn't want to discuss it in that section because I wanted to make sure I had a separate spot for, well, a volcanic winter. During 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption took place and literally cooled the Earth's climate, specifically Europe's and China's climate. And for 18 months, across China and Europe, there was a dark sky consistently, temperatures dropping as low as 2.5 degrees Celsius. And because of that unusual decrease in temperature during these 18 months, people not only experienced severe weather anomalies, but also widespread famine. But on top of both of these things, I can only imagine how scared and concerned people were, because this volcanic eruption happened in Iceland. So people in China and medieval Europe really didn't know what was going on. They just saw clouds that came and never left. And the results of these clouds were devastating. And while we don't exactly know how many people died due to the famine and political unrest that were caused by the volcanic winter of 536 AD, this entire situation was basically just rubbing salt in the wounds of what was already happening during the late antiquity period. And I don't want to harp on the late antiquity so much, but let's just kind of recap. Consistent wars and raids, famine, economic collapse, a massive bubonic plague pandemic, and on top of all of this, a year and a half where the sky was just darker and everything was colder, which caused people to get really weird and squirrely, food to die, and weather to get weird. Like for example, in China, it literally snowed during the summertime. Following 536 AD, there was something known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from 536 to 660, because after this 18 months of the initial cloud dust that caused a volcanic winter, there was other eruptions that happened shortly after that prolonged the cooling of the Earth at this time. So even though 536 is the year that gets all the fame, there was roughly a 130-year period where the Earth was just colder, and it was literally known as a Little Ice Age. Ridiculous. Fast forwarding out of the late antiquity period for the second time, we're now moving on into the mid-1300s when medieval Europe is in full swing and we are now experiencing one of the most devastating pandemics of all time, the Black Death. In all of Europe and even areas outside of Europe from 1347 to 1351, basically nobody was safe from one of the deadliest pandemics to ever happen. Now, we've already discussed the bubonic plague that took place during the late antiquity period, but I had to discuss the Black Death because it was so culturally significant and it was so devastating. So I'm going to make this part short, but I had to mention it. During this roughly 4-year period, the Black Death wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of all of Europe's population, which is almost unfathomable to think about. In numbers, the death toll is estimated to be around 50 million in Europe and up to potentially 200 million globally. Like, let's just say it killed an average of 50% of people in Europe. That means 1 in 2 people were killed by the plague in only a few-year period. That is so hard to even imagine. And on top of the sheer terrifying nature of half of the people that were living now dying, there's also massive social and political impacts because of the Black Death, adding gas to the fire of this already out of control situation. And it's for that reason that being alive during the mid-1300s would be one of the worst times to ever be born or live in general, because everybody was terrified of the disease that was going around. Nobody knew how to properly treat or prevent this disease. Half of everybody you know is dying from this disease. And if you were to be born in this setting, it must have seemed like the world was just ending around you. And for that reason, it's more than obvious why you would have not wanted to been born or live during this period of time. And seeing as disease and pandemics are inescapable on this list, I do have another example to discuss. And it takes place during the late 1400s. But this is a time that is specifically tragic for a specific group of people: Native Americans. Europeans decided to take a trip over to America, and it ended in 95% of all indigenous populations effectively being wiped out, because Americans were immune to and carried diseases that the Native Americans have never seen before. But it wasn't only the diseases that made the colonization of the Americas so devastating for the Native Americans, but it was also the social and religious and cultural aspects of the entire colonization by the Europeans. If you were a Native American living anywhere in North America, basically any time after 1492 was a really tragic time to be born and alive. As I mentioned previously, when the Europeans began to colonize Americas, the spread of old world diseases such as smallpox led to one of the deadliest biological disasters basically ever recorded. It's estimated that up to 55 million or 95% of Native Americans passed away just from diseases alone. But that's really where the suffering began. If you were an indigenous person during the time of colonization, not only did you experience the widespread disease, but also widespread violence, displacement, and essentially destruction. The Europeans at this point already had gunpowder, and now they realized that they had an unintentional bioweapon that they could use at will. And because of this, many indigenous groups were simply at the mercy of the Europeans that were colonizing their land, which meant that people were moved out of places that they've lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Wars took place on people that were already weak and had low morale, and the entire Native American way of life was not only in jeopardy, but on the verge of being destroyed forever. The settlers and explorers from Europe that were living in the Americas didn't have an easy life either. But compared to what the indigenous people experienced during this time, it's not even comparable. And keep in mind, these European explorers and settlers, they chose to embark on this mission. The Native Americans didn't ask for any of this. They were living their own life until the Europeans inserted themselves and brought over germs and steel. And even to this very day, you can still see the effects of this colonization on Native American communities. The colonization of the Americas is another example of an extremely harsh and tragic transition period that happened throughout history. And for better or for worse, it happened. And to have lived or been born as a Native American during this time, it would have been extremely hard and tragic. And for that reason, I had to put it on this list. And for the last time in this video, I actually wanted to discuss an entire time period. And I saved it for the end because it might not fit the criteria for some people, as this time period is prehistoric. And it's also pre-human. It's known as the Carboniferous period, and it took place from 539 million BC to 299 million BC. And while humans didn't exist during this time period, if you were to have been born in this time period, you would have been wishing you weren't. The Earth was much different hundreds of millions of years ago, with one of the most notable changes being the oxygen level being much higher than it is today. As of right now, the air we breathe is only roughly 21% oxygen, but during the Carboniferous period, the air was 35% oxygen, which sounds great until you remember that oxygen is actually highly flammable, which meant that during this time period where forests were rich and lush, massive forest fires took place and would rage uncontrollably, sometimes for months or years on end. But that's only the start to some of the Carboniferous shenanigans. Because sure, if you were to be born in this time period, the air alone would cause health issues and would likely cause oxygen toxicity over time, but potentially that's something you could acclimate to. Scientists let me know. But forest fires aside, you would have been faced with some of the most devastating and disgusting creatures of all time. Keep in mind, the Carboniferous period is far before the dinosaurs. So if there was no humans and no dinosaurs, what was roaming the earth? And the answer is insects and arthropods. And these creatures thrived in this oxygen-rich environment, which meant that they could grow to insane sizes. That's right, the Carboniferous period was essentially a time when the entire planet was overrun by huge bugs. there was giant dragonflies that had wingspans that were over 2 feet long. And there was over 3.5 foot long millipedes that would just be crawling around. And these are only 2 examples of some of the creatures that existed during this time. This time period is also known as the Golden Age of Sharks, which as a human means that it's definitely not the golden age for you, which is just another reason why this entire period of time would be horrible to be a human, or alive as a human for that matter. But in case the prosperity of sharks and giant bugs weren't enough to kind of creep you out, there was also mega arachne, because of course there was. And what that means is there was giant spiders. Spiders that got as big as a human head, which, I mean, I guess comparably to the size of the other animals I discussed isn't that big, but I mean, I don't want to touch any spider, let alone a spider the size of my head. Even though the Carboniferous period likely would have been extremely beautiful, with the rich oxygen causing lush rainforests and greenery to thrive globally, due to the residents of the earth at this time, you would have definitely not wanted to experience it every time the world almost ended. I don't know about you guys, but to me, it seems like doomsday scares are only becoming more and more common. Every day, we're either being told that the world is going to end or actively ending, and honestly, I'm just sick of it. If you're old enough to qualify for a senior's discount, then you might remember the Y2K scare of the year 2000. And if you're at least old enough to use this website, then you might remember the 2012 scare where the world was supposed to end as well. Regardless, all of these fake world-ending events got me thinking, what were genuine times in history when the world was its closest to ending? And well, my findings are this video. And as always, this video is only going to get crazier as it goes on. The Carrington Event. It's a warm summer's night on August 28th, 1859. The sun had only just set, and this night was supposed to be like any other. Typically, after the sun sets, the sky only gets darker and darker. However, on this night, the sky was illuminated like never before. Eyewitnesses report that the sky appeared to be illuminated from the heavens, and others mentioned how the sky was a deep red as if it were engulfed by a wildfire. The night sky was so bright, in fact, that it actually awoke gold miners working in the Rocky Mountains, and they not only woke up, but began their workday in the middle of the night because they assumed the sun had risen. And it's reported that in New York, you could even read the newspaper at midnight due to how bright the night sky was. With this being said, it begs the question, what was in the night sky? Was it an asteroid? Was it a wildfire? Well, some of you might have already guessed that it was the Aurora Borealis. But these were no regular northern lights. The lights that were seen in the night sky on August 28th were visible for nearly a week. But it's not just the duration that's impressive. These lights were visible globally. Not only was the aurora visible from the North and South Poles, but it was also visible through North America, South America, Cuba, Hawaii, Japan, China, and even New Zealand. But this aurora wasn't just a pretty light show. Although it was an interesting spectacle to witness at night, during the day, this aurora was wreaking havoc on the rather simple technology that existed, most notably telegraphs. Because of the geomagnetic-induced current from the electromagnetic field, telegraphs all across the world failed. But not only did they fail, they even shocked the operators. Telegraphs in some locations were sparking, breaking, and curiously, in some locations, telegraph operators were disconnecting their batteries from the telegraphs, and the telegraphs would still work without power. There's even a recorded conversation between 2 telegraph operators in Boston and Portland, who both disconnected the batteries from their telegraphs, but were still able to have a 2-hour-long conversation. And while this is interesting, it doesn't necessarily sound apocalyptic. And well, you'd be right, and that's because the Carrington event was caused by a massive solar flare, an event that is typically pretty harmless to humans. However, I wanted to mention it first in this video for 2 reasons. 1, because it's the most tame entry on this list we're going to discuss, and 2, because it's extremely interesting to theorize what would have happened if this solar storm happened in the modern day, a day where we rely so heavily on technology. And luckily, we don't have to speculate, because in June of 2013, a joint venture from researchers at Lloyd's of London and the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Committee used real data from the Carrington event to estimate the cost of a similar event in the modern day. And what they estimated was that if the Carrington event took place in 2013, it would have cost in the US alone $600 billion to $2.6 trillion in damages, which at the time would have ranged from roughly 3 to 15% of the annual GDP for the entire country. But numbers aside, what would this look like for humans? And the reality is scary. Most of the world would experience one of the biggest blackouts of all time, and this blackout alone would cause major issues, such as lack of communications, lack of transportation, lack of refrigeration, and so much more. Traffic lights would go down, hospitals would lose power, air traffic control would lose communication with planes, grocery stores would be empty, looting and riots would begin. Like, seriously, just imagine if the world lost electricity for even 2 weeks straight. Now imagine that going on for months. and maybe even years. So much would be going wrong. Besides just that, all banking and purchases would be unavailable, supply chains would basically completely halt, and the economy and likely civilization would be set back hundreds of years, if not eliminated entirely. And that's really not an exaggeration. If a Carrington event took place in the modern day and it was not detected in advance and precautions were not taken in advance, then it's estimated that it would take up to a decade for all of the power grids that were affected by the solar storm to be fully restored. Now, before you get too scared about a whole modern day Carrington event, understand that with modern technology, we would be able to detect and plan for a Carrington level event to ensure that none of this happens. But before I give you too much hope, understand that some experts say that Carrington level events take place every roughly 150 years. And the last Carrington event was 160 years ago, meaning that to some, we could be overdue. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is likely one of the most famous historical situations that had relatively minimal casualties, but could have potentially resulted in the most casualties ever recorded. I think it's safe to assume that most of us are familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, I will give a brief summary for those who are not so familiar. But beyond that, I want to focus not only on the entire situation, but on some of the more notable events that took place within the missile crisis that brought us inches from nuclear war between two of the world's largest superpowers. In October of 1962, the Soviet Union decided to secretly put nuclear missiles within Cuba. This secret operation was quickly exposed to the American government, and instantly concerns were high. Why are the Soviets breaking their agreement, and why are they putting nuclear warheads 90 miles away from our soil? Tensions were obviously at an all-time high, and slow communication and language barriers did not make the situation any easier. Once these secret missiles were exposed, the US government knew they had to respond, but they had to also be strategic because they knew the wrong response could result in nuclear war. It's kind of ironic because at this time, America already had nuclear warheads in Turkey off the coast of Russia. However, with the Soviets now having nukes off the coast of America, things were serious. And while I know that's an oversimplified explanation, it's kind of all I got for right now. But one interesting observation I'll make was that although tensions were extremely high, from my understanding, the leaders of both the United States and the Soviet Union did not want to go into a nuclear war, obviously because they both knew very well that this could result in the end of humanity. However, for the soldiers that were actually on site seeing their enemy directly in front of them, the urge to take shots and potentially start a war was a lot more appealing. And it's actually those situations that I want to talk about. During the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, the US President John F. Kennedy really just wanted to find the best way to have the missiles removed from Cuba peacefully. And the leader of the Soviet Union kind of just wanted to have their secret operation to be swept under the rug without repercussion. And obviously the result of the entire crisis was a mutual agreement to have nukes removed from Cuba and Turkey. However, what took place during the 13 days of the crisis left humanity inches from ceasing to exist. One notable incident that took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis happened on October 25th, 1962. It was late at night at the Duluth, Minnesota military base, when one of the guards noticed a suspicious figure climbing the fence into the military base. Obviously, the guard understood what was going on and realized that this military base was under attack. He quickly ran to his post and pulled a sabotage alarm. However, by some, the sabotage alarm was misunderstood and was actually taken as an alarm that activated a launch alert at Volk Field in Wisconsin. And this launch alert that was activated at Volk Field prompted the immediate deployment of nuclear-armed jets. With these nuclear-armed jets having their sights aimed at basically anything Soviet, if one of them were to have fired on Soviet or potentially even Cuban troops, America would have likely been met with nuclear retaliation, sparking the first ever nuclear war. Now here's the interesting part. After these alarms were set off, it was discovered that there was no person sabotaging or climbing into the military base at all. What the guard had noticed was actually a bear climbing the military base fence. And with that discovery, the launch of the nuclear-armed planes was canceled with only minutes to spare before pilots took off and the first nuclear war ever would have begun. This was only one example of numerous odd situations that took place during an extremely tense time where the relationship between the Soviet Union and America was razor thin. And even mistaking a bear on a military base in Minnesota could have caused the world to end. World War II. Okay, hear me out. I figured if we're going to talk about the time we almost had a nuclear war, we should probably talk about the time there was literally nukes dropped within war. But I know I've talked about World War II a lot on this channel, so I'll keep this segment brief. I would say at this point, it's generally accepted that World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. The entire 6-year war involved over 100 million people from 30 different countries, and battles literally took place on every continent beside Antarctica. And this entire brutal situation ended in 1945 when Germany surrendered to the Allied powers in May, and Japan Japan was forced into submission in August when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. And well, once again, that's a massive oversimplification. You get the idea. World War II was hell on earth and literally killed an estimated 70 to 85 million, which was roughly 3% of the world's population at that time. So not only did the world almost end, but humanity lost 3% of its population, which is insane. But besides all of the crazy things that actually took place in World War II, let's discuss some of the things that almost took place. One of the most notable things that was bubbling was the development of nuclear bombs in the hands of the Nazis. That's right, after attacks on German soil, Hitler wanted to retaliate on American soil badly. He's even quoted saying that he wants to level all of New York and basically capture the rest of America. Hitler wanted so deeply to bring World War II to American soil that he was literally developing a bomber plane that could fly to America and back, and he just so happened at the same time to be developing a nuclear bomb as well. Unfortunately, the Nazis never got their hands on functioning nuclear bombs. I don't think it's hard to imagine what would have happened if they did, and the world that we live in today would look a lot different if it even still existed. And just imagine what would have happened if Japan decided to have nuclear retaliation against America. Japan had already successfully brought World War II to American soil, and if they happened to have had functional nukes and a death wish, then they too could have escalated World War II into global annihilation. But of course, during World War II, only America had successfully developed nukes, and as a result, they essentially told the entire world to sit down. And the nukes that were dropped on Japan is still a lesson that has not been forgotten to this day. And I actually think that it's those nukes that were dropped in World War II that gave America and the Soviet Union so much reluctance to actually use the nukes that they were placing, which is a good thing. And thinking about these situations now, it's almost like comparing a balancing act to dominoes. Because in World War II, it seems like one domino hit another domino and the situation kept escalating and escalating until more and more countries and more deaths happened until at the very end, we saw nearly 100 million deaths, every continent, nearly every major country, and the most deadly weapon ever produced finally put a stop to the entire situation. However, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the entire situation was a balancing act trying to not go too far in either direction to actually trigger anything because the tensions and technology were already so high that one wrong move or one domino falling could have literally led to the end of the world. The Bonilla Observation. This genuinely might be my favorite story in the entire video. In the year 1883, there was a Mexican astronomer named Jose Bonilla, and during a regular shift, Bonilla noticed something relatively obscure in his telescope. And for this reason, Bonilla took many photographs and wrote many notes of what he was seeing through his telescope. Interestingly, the photos that he took are regarded as some of the first images of unidentified flying objects, but trust me when I say this section has nothing to do with aliens. The objects that were seen through the telescope were basically impossible to decipher. Like, just look at this image on screen right now. Can you tell what that is? And for that reason, it was basically left to speculation. Bonilla ended up spending 2 days taking 447 ink photographs of the objects he was seeing through his telescope. And in the following years, Bonilla actually had his observations published in a French astronomy magazine. And French astronomers that observed Bonilla's photographs essentially said pretty confidently that there was either birds flying above the telescope or insects crawling on the telescope or something along that line. And roughly 40 years later, in 1920, Bonilla passed away. And while that is where Bonilla's story ends, that's not where the story of his observation ends. Because in October of 2011, 90 years after Bonilla had passed away, another Mexican astronomer decided to take a peek at some of Bonilla's photos. And the conclusion that he came to was not that he had seen geese or dust or bugs, but he actually had witnessed a comet exploding in space. And these modern-day Mexican astronomers were able to extrapolate that, assuming that Bonilla's timings and notes were correct when observing his UFO through his telescope, it's believed that the objects that he was witnessing were roughly 500 to 8,000 kilometers above Earth's surface, and roughly 70 meters to 800 meters in length. And because Bonilla observed 447 objects in roughly 3 hours, and over 3,200 objects in a 25-hour period, the modern-day astronomers estimated that the original comet before it exploded had a mass that was roughly equivalent to 8 times of Halley's Comet. But they not only estimated the size of the original comet, but also said that if any of the fragments of this broken comet had impacted with the Earth, it would have likely been the equivalent of 3,275 Tunguska events in 2 days. And if that means nothing to you, then just understand that the Tunguska event was a massive explosion roughly 3 to 50 megatons in size that took place in Russia in 1908. That singular explosion alone was significant. But what these astronomers are claiming is that if these comet fragments that flew extremely close to the Earth had impacted with the Earth, it would have resulted in an explosion over 100,000 megatons in size, causing something they called, quote, probably an extinction event. And while the thought of this story is absolutely terrifying, I also kind of love the implications. There was a Mexican astronomer who saw something interesting and spent 2 days studying it. He submits his notes notes and photos for publishing in France, and they basically go, oh, you saw a bird, you saw a bug. He then dies, and 100 years later, other Mexican astronomers are like, oh, no, that's not a bird or a bug. That was basically the closest we've ever come to asteroid-induced human annihilation in, well, a long time. The Lake Toba eruption. Every situation we've discussed so far has occurred in roughly modern history. However, this is the turning point of the video where we get prehistoric, which is actually a good thing because the situations we're about to discuss are literally insane. And the Lake Toba super eruption is a great start to the second half of this list. Lake Toba, Indonesia is the modern day location of one of the most severe volcanic eruptions possibly in all of Earth's history. And it's believed by some that the result of this eruption was a trackable decline in human genetic variation. But let me take a step back. The Toba super eruption that we're discussing is actually the most recent in a series of eruptions that happened in the same volcano. This Toba eruption we're discussing took place only 74,000 years ago. And I say only because the eruption that took place before this one took place 1.2 million years ago, meaning that within the context, this one wasn't too long ago. Regardless, this eruption was significant. And as I mentioned, it was a super eruption. And what qualifies it as a super eruption was the fact that it had an estimated volcanic index of 8, making it the largest known explosive volcanic eruption in almost all of Earth's history. And I know that kind of just sounds like a lot of big numbers, but to kind of try to put this in a bit of context, in 2022, when the Hunga Tonga eruption took place, that volcanic eruption was estimated to have released 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash. And if you look at the pictures and videos and satellite imagery of that explosion, that is so much ash that was released, and it was truly a devastating event. However, if you think 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash is a lot, the Toba super eruption released 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. And this volcanic material had a major impact on the Earth's climate. Unsurprisingly, this volcanic eruption caused a volcanic winter, but this winter was rather significant, not only because it blocked out the sun's rays from entering the Earth's atmosphere, causing a global cooling by several degrees, but it's also believed that this period caused a 1,000-year cold period following the initial volcanic winter. Although that claim is disputed by some, and others say it would have only lasted 3 to 6 years before temperatures would have gotten within a few degrees of, once again, normal. Regardless if the cooling period was 6 years or 1,000 years, the effects were the same. Crops and vegetation across the world withered and died off, causing animals to die, and therefore massive famines among early human populations. And this volcanic winter isn't just speculation either. Core samples from both Greenland and Antarctica confirm a sharp cooling period at this exact time in history. But this is where things get really interesting, because some researchers believe that the Toba eruption was so significant that it's actually linked to a genetic bottleneck that took place during human evolution. And within this theory, it's believed that the global human population was drastically reduced to essentially a few thousand humans. That's it. Just imagine that, a global population of humans in the thousands. That is a crazy thought. And to some researchers, it's believed that this catastrophic event is the exact reason why there is a relatively low level of genetic variation in humans, because there was a time where so many humans were wiped out, and we all stem from a group of a few thousand humans roughly 75,000 years ago. And while this theory isn't necessarily proven or unproven, in the scientific world it's considered controversial, as the theory is making a bold claim and it's not quite proven yet, and there is some physical evidence to disprove it as well, meaning the conversation is still actively ongoing and relatively heated as well. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. The facts are this: 74,000 years ago, there was one of the biggest volcanic eruptions of all time, and it undoubtedly had a huge impact on human, animal, and vegetative life across the entire globe. And while the Toba super eruption is crazy to think about, it's even crazier to imagine what would have happened if the circumstances were just a bit worse, and if the Earth just got a little bit colder. Because if that were the case, potentially those last few thousand humans wouldn't have existed, and you and I would not be here to tell the story today. The Chicxulub impact. Okay, quickly, before we get into this one, I realized how short we are for time, so if you guys are enjoying this video and want a part 2 with near world-ending events, please either leave a like or leave a comment telling me you want part 2. I'd be happy to make it, but for this video, I gotta kind of end it in this section. But with that being said, we're ending on a bang, literally. The Chicxulub impact is likely the most famous asteroid impact on Earth in the last billion years, let's say. If you're telling yourself, I've never heard of the Chicxulub impact or the Chicxulub crater, then allow me to speak in more broad terms. The Chicxulub impact or the Chicxulub crater is believed to be the impact site of the asteroid that killed 75% of all life on Earth. all plants, all animals, all vegetation, and this includes the death of all dinosaurs. I should reiterate that it's not the death of this life forms, it's the instant extinction of these life forms, meaning that likely 99.9% of all animals died, but 75% of all life forms were permanently extinct forever. But that's not even the craziest part. What's crazy is that for decades now, researchers have believed that dinosaurs must have been taken out by something instant and likely not from this world. And while this was unproven and unpopular in the scientific community, evidence was building, specifically a definitive layer of clay within the Earth's sedimentary rock that is dated to be roughly 66 million years old and is full of an element known as iridium. Interestingly, iridium is technically considered to be the most rare element in all of the Earth's crust, meaning that when it was found in levels that were over 100 times normal, there was something to be said there. And interestingly, iridium is more commonly found in asteroids in space than it is on Earth, further validating the theory that potentially there was a massive impact that took place on Earth, and during the impact, the asteroid vaporized, shooting all of this iridium into the atmosphere, settling across the entire globe in this layer of sedimentary rock. But still, this wasn't enough to satisfy the scientific community, and it wasn't until the 1970s when it was proven that there was an impact site hidden off the coast of Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this took place when an oil rig was drilling off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. What this company found when drilling wasn't oil, but actually shocked quartz, which can only be found in large amounts at an asteroid impact site, further validating the theory at the time that there was a massive impact that took place that also caused a global event. I could go really deep into the weeds about the scientific politics that took place during the entire discovery of the situation, but the result was this. It was eventually found out and confirmed that there is a massive impact site off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The crater is roughly 200 kilometers in diameter and roughly 30 kilometers deep. It's believed that the asteroid was roughly 19 kilometers wide and approached Earth at a speed of 36,000 miles per hour. And the impact that took place 66 million years ago had results that life on Earth had likely never seen before. The direct impact itself is estimated to have an explosion equivalent to a bomb that was over 100 million megatons in size. And the result of this violent explosion was global earthquakes in magnitudes over 10, massive global tsunamis, massive global volcanic eruptions, massive global forest fires due to flaming debris falling essentially globally, and then global cooling caused by all of the debris that was sent into the atmosphere, blocking out any natural sunlight. Literally, just imagine the strongest forest fires, the strongest winds, the strongest storms, the strongest explosions, the strongest earthquakes, the strongest natural disasters, all happening all at once times 1 million. I am literally struggling to find the metaphors and words to try to convey the power and impact of this sheer event. And honestly, I feel like I'm doing a poor job, so just understand this. The Chicxulub impact was undoubtedly one of the most, if not the most, significant times in history when not only humanity, but the world was closest to ending. How humans survived in every time period. This is you. The average, everyday, modern human being. Historically speaking, you are soft, squishy, and weak. And although you may not look like it, you are an apex predator, residing at the very top of the global food chain. But this has not always been the case. And this evolution of human dominance has taken hundreds of thousands of years to manifest. And where it's gotten us is you laying on the couch ordering Uber Eats without a care in the world. But the struggles that humanity has faced to get us to this very position is anything but pretty. And it's for this very reason that we are going to be investigating exactly how humans endured and survived every era of history, as well as seeing what it would take for a modern human to survive in previous time periods. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The first thing you're going to notice after being dropped in the Stone Age is the sheer shock of how little you truly have. In the Stone Age, you have no phone, wallet, glasses, watch, clothes. You are truly left to your own devices, and it's up to you to figure out how to survive. Luckily, not too far in the distance, you notice a small tribe of humans, and you know better than to interact with them, so you start by observing them. One of the first things you notice is how little these people have. This small tribe of humans have animal pelts draped over their body, and beyond that, appear to only have a pile of rocks and sticks at their disposal. The settlement that they're in is rudimentary and looks almost temporary, and that's because humans at this point in the early Stone Age are still primarily nomadic, meaning that long-term settlements aren't established yet. And although these people are occupying this area now, they likely won't be there in a few months, as they will likely seasonally follow animals in different weather patterns. Taking a closer look at this pile of sticks, you notice that they're not just sticks, they're actually tools. And these rocks that they're carrying all serve a purpose. Some of these longer sticks have pointed, jagged rocks at the ends, while some of the shorter sticks have large black rocks attached to them. and you notice that these are spears and obsidian axes. You notice one of these people actually creating these tools. They are literally using stones to carve out other stones. At this point, you're already taking a mental note of how simple the Stone Age appears to be in comparison to the modern day. And while that is definitely true, it's important to also note that just because something is simple, it does not mean that it's easy. Besides just sitting around and crafting stone tools that literally define this entire time period, there are a lot of other skills required to survive. One of the more unlikely culprits is actually social skills, which may seem a bit random, but when you think about it, your tribe in the Stone Age is literally your lifeline. Every aspect of life is so time-consuming and takes so much effort. Collecting food, cooking food, fabricating tools, preparing pelts, migrating. Literally everything takes so long. And it truly does take a village in the Stone Age just to support each other, because everybody plays their role. We are talking about real hunter-gatherer times. And it's for this reason that you need to provide value to the group that you live in. Because if you are in a group and you are unable to perform in any aspect of your tribe, there's a very likely chance that you're going to be exiled. If your gathering sessions are consistently unfruitful, and if you are simply not pulling your weight in the group, then the entire group is going to have to make the decision between picking up your slack or cutting off the weakest link and exiling you from the tribe. And during a time where every day is a struggle to survive, you do not even have the luxury of picking up anybody else's slack. And for the edgy lone wolves watching this video, being alone in the Stone Age may not seem like such a bad thing until you realize that not only does every aspect of life require a group to truly thrive, but in this time period, you're also susceptible not only to nature, but natural predators. Because that's right, in the Stone Age, humans definitely have natural predators. And if one of these predators see a lone human walking around, they're either going to assume you're old, sick, exiled, lost, and it doesn't really matter which one is the case, because in any of those instances, you are vulnerable, meaning that a predator can easily make you lunch. With this new realization, you decide to introduce yourself to this group and make yourself at home, because the only way you as a modern person has any chance is by making some good friends. Fortunately, this tribe takes you in, but you are tasked with your first job, making fire. Another essential skill of Stone Age survival. As you gather a few sticks, you realize that the entire tribe is looking at you. And they didn't give you this task as a job, they gave it to you as a test. Because if you can't start a fire, then there is absolutely no way you can pull any weight, and they're better off leaving you behind. Although fortunately for you, you watched Survivor Man a time or two and spun a stick on a log like your life depended on it, getting a kindling going, and then a small fire, proving your worth to the group and ensuring your survival, at least for that day. As the day goes on, you are informed that it's now time to hunt. The tribe has sharpened tools, a new fire, and it's time to eat. And you're being invited to hunt with the tribe. With no other option, you accept the offer and you begin on the journey. One of the first things you realize is that while these people may be human, they are definitely not the same as you, because their endurance is next level. These hunters that you are struggling to keep up with can seemingly run for days. And not only that, they know exactly where they're going and they can read the landscape like the back of their hands. This deep connection to the landscape you inhabit is crucial for long-lasting survival in the wild. And as a modern human, it's a skill set you're going to have to develop. But for a Stone Age human, this is the only life you know, because you are still deeply connected and ingrained in nature. After a successful hunt, you return back to the camp exhausted, while the others you went out with seem barely phased at all. And that's because for you, this was the workout of a lifetime. But for these prehistoric people, this was simply everyday life. And this experience gave you a lot of context into how humans survived in the Stone Age. Survival wasn't a hobby or a job or entertainment. Survival was a daily task, day in and day out. And there was no work-life balance, because your life was work. And anything you needed, you had to work for. The clothes on your back, the food in your stomach, the wood in the fire, the stone on your spear, the cave that you're sleeping in. Everything required effort. And with that, we understand that Stone Age humans survived because of their deep understanding of the landscape that they inhabited. And these skills allowed them to consistently find places to live temporarily or even long term. And on top of their geographical knowledge, their ability to fashion tools out of materials simply laying on the ground is extremely impressive, and allowed them to not only catch animals and protect themselves, but also to create clothing and process food and make other tools. And with that, if you could understand the landscape and develop your own tools, then the only other thing you really needed was the ability to create fire. And with that, you had every aspect of life essentially covered. Besides, obviously, shelter and water, but those are also part of understanding the landscape, because the water that you get comes from natural sources. And during the early Stone Age, most of the places you inhabit are also typically natural structures, or extremely simple structures made using natural materials. Because of this experience you've had with these Stone Age people, you've gained gained a newfound respect for prehistoric humans. And although you now have a better understanding of how cave people lived, you also are very certain that you want to spend no more time during the Stone Age, because you've been spoiled by the modern day, and the Stone Age is interesting, but it also makes camping look like a 5-star resort. And with that, we decide it's time to move on to the next time period. The Bronze Age. One of the first things you need to be aware of before we drop you into the Bronze Age is this. The Stone Age literally took place over the course of millions of years. But the Bronze Age is where we truly see the beginning of human technological development hit an exponential point. Because what humans are about to develop over the next couple thousand years is going to make the development over the millions of years in the Stone Age seem like child's play. Although it was obviously a necessary part of our human development. After being dropped in the Bronze Age, you almost don't recognize the world that you were looking at. Obviously, there are some glaring similarities between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, but the differences are stark. One of the first things you notice is that the people aren't wearing pelts anymore. They're wearing clothes. And now you feel underdressed because you're the only one wearing a loincloth. But beyond just the clothing that people are wearing, society looks completely different than it did in the Stone Age. In the Bronze Age, we see people begin to create settlements, and with that we see agriculture, we see animal farming, we see settlements, and for the first time we see two very important innovations. We see metal forging and we see the wheel. The collection and forging of metals is what obviously separates the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. And while upgrading from obsidian tools to copper swords is definitely an improvement and ensures that tools are able to last a lot longer, it isn't the only notable change by far. Having tools made in a new material is cool, but having a new material that allows the door to open for expertise to flourish and for unique tools to exist definitely opened up the floodgates for more innovation. With metal forging existing, we now have a method for creative people to develop and hone in their skills. And instead of relying on using a dull rock to sharpen a sharp rock, we now have the opportunity to create nearly anything we can imagine, at least for the time. And with that, the simple introduction of this new metal alone, society begins to evolve, because now we have artisans and experts, and then we have early jobs and an early economy based off of these new items and metals. And things are already developing at a pace quicker than I can describe. But besides just having new metals and new jobs because of it, we also have the wheel. And the wheel was crucial for literally mobilizing society. Not only did we see civilization establish settlements in the Bronze Age, but we also saw settlements become connected because of the wheel. And these settlements became connected through trade routes and war. Two things that also went on to further evolve society. However, even with all of these revolutionary technological developments, the Bronze Age to a modern human still seems like an extremely slow and barbaric way of life. And for that reason, you need to learn exactly how to acclimate to this time period. Fortunately, the development you found yourself near has almost everything a human could need. And one of the first things you do is get yourself some new drip, because that loincloth had the ladies and the men looking at you the wrong way. Walking through this village, you understand that community is still extremely important. However, this stage of the game, by game I mean history, is a lot less grindy. Instead of spending all day looking for berries, you're simply picking the berries in the garden. Instead of spending the entire day looking for a goat, you are simply taking one from the farm. And instead of feeling like you have to do everything all the time, for the first time you feel like you actually have the opportunity to specialize and focus on something. And although things are definitely looking a lot better than they did in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, you still need to make sure that you're carrying your own weight, because at the end of the day, you need to put a roof over your head and food in your stomach today. And what that means is you once again need to provide value. And while the value you provide in the Bronze Age looks different than the Stone Age, the general concept still applies. There are no free lunches, and if you want to survive, you need to do something. Although in the Bronze Age, there are more opportunities. Since your goal is survival, you decide that joining any sort of army is not for you, and you're also not interested in any form of combat sport involving a copper sword. You briefly ponder potentially becoming a criminal, because then anything you want is free. Although, after seeing how basically every crime can be punishable by death during this period of time, you realize that a modest job may be your best way of surviving. Even though there's a lot more technology in the Bronze Age, the components required for life are still the same. You need food, water, and shelter. And the one job that you identify that can provide you all of this is farming. Because of the new tools and methods introduced in the Bronze Age, mass farming is at an all-time high, at least relatively. And for that reason, there's a lot of opportunity to work within farming. And a lot of these jobs provide food, shelter, and water in return for your all-day, indefinite, back-breaking labor. It's not glamorous, but your goal here is survival. You're not trying to be rich or famous, you simply just want to live a long, safe life. But after making yourself useful on the farm and breaking your back, even though you now have new tools, a wheel, and new clothes, you decide it's time to continue moving. Because although the Bronze Age and the Stone Age feel like night and day in human history, you know that there's a lot more to come, and you want to experience it. The Iron Age. The difference between Bronze Age and Iron Age is not nearly as shocking as the difference between Stone Age and Bronze Age. However, it doesn't mean that the advancements are any less important. During the Iron Age, we don't necessarily see an entirely new way of life, although we see an expansion upon the previously established way of life in the Bronze Age, with some improvements. Obviously, the most notable difference being the new metal at play. Iron changed the metal tool game like never before, and that's because it was readily available and extremely durable. And because of that, iron tools became economical, and what that means is not only was there some tools, there was a lot of tools. And with more tools being in the hands of more people, human development began to ramp up even quicker than before. And because of this, we start to see society truly hit scale. Farming, both agriculture and livestock, became more optimized. Iron mining became more optimized. Metal forging became more optimized, and there was more of it. And because of this, everything that the Bronze Age really established, the Iron Age was able to run with. And that's kind of a common theme in every time period so far. Every lesson, development, technique developed in the previous time period can be applied and expanded upon in the next one. And that's kind of life in general, if you think about it. Regardless, with yourself being dropped in the Iron Age, my advice to you on surviving wouldn't be much different from the Bronze Age. Make sure you are refining your social skills to have a good circle of people around you, and make sure that you are obeying the law, make sure you're not getting yourself into any wars, and make sure that you're making yourself valuable without making yourself a target. Since you already have experience from farming in the Bronze Age, I would recommend farming once again in the Iron Age. You could make a living, afford shelter, afford food, be around water, and if everything took a nasty turn, you would at least have the skill set to provide for yourself if all else fails. And might I add, in this time period, to take up some sort of sword fighting hobby in the background. Not because you want to fight in a war, but because you want to be able to protect yourself in any situation. And like they say, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. The medieval era. One of the first things you notice after landing yourself specifically in medieval England is the difference in people. There's civilizations like you saw in the Iron Age, although this civilization is different. It's obviously more developed, but one of the biggest things you notice is the sheer amount of class separation. Most of the people you see roaming the streets don't look super different than they did in the Iron Age. Although you do see almost a new class of people. You see merchants with elaborate clothing. You see nobility with clean robes. And you even get a glimpse of the king going down the street. And it's with this initial impression that you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore. Besides the differences that you see, there's a big difference that you can smell. Because being smack dab in the middle of medieval England, you can smell everybody and everything. And that's because with how developed cities have become, people are being more and more crammed into smaller and smaller places. And for that reason, everybody is literally in everybody else's business. And if you thought working on a farm in the Iron Age smelled bad, well, just smell medieval England. And make sure you keep your mouth closed if you see anybody on the second floor dropping fudge popsicles out of a bucket from their window. After noticing this rather large wealth gap, you understand that if you want to survive, your best chance is by at least having a bit of money. Because the vast majority of poor serfs, unless they are skilled laborers that are able to stay in town, are typically sent to the countryside for agricultural jobs. And while that was something you have experience in, you don't want to slave your life away anymore. And the life of a serf in medieval times is typically not one that screams longevity. Long hours, poor food, poor healthcare, no education, unsafe work conditions. There's a lot that could go wrong. And for that reason, with your goal of surviving, you want to have at least a few shillings in your pocket. You end up cozying up to a local sword merchant. And while this is a suitable side gig and you're able to learn the business and grow within the company, you realize that this society is a lot more complex than previous times. Obviously, royalty is relatively new in your historical travels, but on top of this, religion is a massive staple, not only in day-to-day life, but also in your survival. In medieval England, the Roman Catholic Church ruled over everything. And for that reason, if you were not following the rules of the church, you could be fined. And if you publicly disobeyed or potentially disagreed with the church, you could be killed. Which is why you quickly begin to study the Bible and learn a few prayers in Latin. After getting your side gig and getting familiar with the local customs, you are now met once again with the harsh reality of sickness. While human development has brought us new major cities, we are now experiencing the downfall of some of these overcramped and unsanitary cities, specifically plagues. And if you just happen to be living through 1348, your best chance of survival would be leaving the city immediately and taking the skills you learned in the Stone and Bronze and Iron Age to live off the land yourself. Because during the plague, even buying bread from somebody could be a death sentence. But outside of these relatively niche plague times, there is still the overarching lack of healthcare. Obviously, there was basically none in any of the previous time periods, but in the medieval era specifically, there was at least development with healthcare, but a lot of these treatments were actually more harm than good. Meaning that if literally anything went wrong, whether it be a broken bone or a small small cut. If you weren't in perfectly good shape and perfectly healthy, you were much closer to death than you would have ever been in the modern day. But even if you were lucky enough to be surviving in the medieval era during a time when there was no plague, you had a job that was making you not a poor serf, you still had to hope to God, literally, that there was not a war on the horizon. Because if you, as a young adult, were summoned to war, you essentially had no option. Either go to war or be killed for not going to war. And if you went to war and got injured, your chances of dying were high. And if you went to war and got injured and survived, once you came home, you would not be able to continue your work and you would essentially be poor on the street and likely die on that street. And with that hard lesson learned, you realize that if you want to survive in medieval times, you need to not only work a job, but be savvy enough to earn a higher than normal income. You have to religiously follow the church. You must never break a law. You must never upset a royal. You must never be in bad health or become injured. And you must hope that a war never breaks out that requires your assistance. And spoiler alert, there was a lot of wars during the Middle Ages. And while you actually find the Middle Ages rather interesting, you know that this was not the place for you. And you decide to continue your journey. The early modern era. The early modern era is the shortest time period we're going to discuss on this list, besides the modern era, which is still ongoing. The early modern era was only 300 years long, spanning from 1500 to 1800 AD. But this time period was pivotal for human civilization. And while it consists of a lot of the things we've already discussed previously, the early modern era specifically is defined not by metals, but by intellectual pursuits, specifically in major developments in both world exploration and scientific pursuits. With the prosperity that Europe saw during the Middle Ages, they decided that their best next course of action during the early modern era was to begin expanding, which is why we saw a plethora of colonization during this time, because these European countries wanted more land, more wealth, more power. And because of this, the early part of the early modern era is rather tumultuous. There is a lot of religious instability, and also instability across the globe with this newfound colonization. And because literally so many revolutions took place during the early modern era, if you have to be a part of one of the revolutions, I would recommend being a part of the scientific revolution, specifically by trying to get your name in the same group as Copernicus, Galileo, or Newton. And while you might be thinking, I'm not nearly as smart as any of those guys, you don't need to be. Because if you're a modern person just being dropped in the early modern era, then you have a plethora of knowledge that you could use to change the world early and make yourself not only a remembered scientist, but also literally a god. But also keep in mind that revealing too much knowledge would actually not get you respected, it would get you killed, because you would just seem crazy. And if you challenge the status quo too much, well, that wouldn't be good for you. So with your goal of survival, you drop hints about knowing things and become a respected philosopher, making sure that you stay vague, but also inspirational. Near the end of the early modern era, you begin to see things that you recognize from the modern era. You see democracy, capitalism, banking, personal individuality, and this is all a part of the Enlightenment near the end of the early modern era. And it's with this realization that you remember that you're almost home. You've been going through almost all of human history, and now your final step is going back to the modern day. And while your time in every different time period has been brutal and tough, and you've missed even the most modern of luxuries like Uber Eats and a toilet, you've definitely grown to respect previous eras of history, and you've had a major boost in respect for people who came before you, and essentially paved the way for you to live the comfortable life you live today. And with that, you realize that there's only one more place to go, and that's returning home, the modern era. Obviously, if you want to know how to live in the modern era, go look in the mirror or ask your grandpa. But I want to point out some interesting nuances that separated the early modern era from the modern era, because the modern era isn't just this week or this month. It dates back all the way to the early 1800s. And even though it was less than 200 years ago, the early 1800s is a much different time and lifestyle than the 2020s. One of the biggest technological advancements during the modern era is the Industrial Revolution, which swept through Europe, America, and eventually the world, and changed not only jobs and economies, but lives forever. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't just the building of factories and a boost in manufacturing jobs. It also meant further development in urban areas, specifically with developments in mining and transportation, with trains, buggies, and eventually cars becoming popular. And these tools, once again, changed the world and allowed further and further exponential development. And while this Industrial Revolution definitely improved the quality of life of some, there is undoubtedly still horrible labor conditions existing for those working in factories. And this includes women and children being paid next to nothing for backbreaking and then sometimes deadly jobs. But it's once again these hardships that people go through that brings us to the modern day, 2025. Now, this is not to say that the modern day is perfect, because it's not by any means. And this also isn't to say that every hardship in the past has been justified because it led us to today. Although, what I am trying to say is that the world we live in today is a work in progress and has been developed by hundreds of thousands of years of human development, driven by the urge to do better and never give up. Humans have always endured, persevered, and grew. And if you look at the timeline of humanity, that is a fact. So, although in the modern day we may have our own issues and be squishier than we used to be, we are still actively participating in this ongoing pursuit of human development, and humans, at the end of the day, are badasses. While there's definitely issues in the modern day, life has never been more comfortable and convenient and easier to at least stay alive in. The richest people in human history. In the modern day, the position of world's richest person fluctuates pretty often, and these fluctuations are typically based off of stock price and other economic factors. And while it's interesting to talk about who the richest person in the modern day is, if you have an inquisitive mind, these thoughts may bring you to the question of who was the richest person in other time periods, and who was the richest person in human history. In this video, we're going to answer both of these questions and more, starting at the very beginning of human civilization, the Stone Age. It may serve as no surprise that because the Stone Age is, well, for the most part, prehistoric, we don't have any verifiable sources of wealthy individuals. That being said, that doesn't mean that we don't know what wealth looked like in the Stone Age, and for that reason, I wanted to at least quickly mention it. As I've mentioned in a few of our previous time period videos, wealth in the Stone Age was measured strictly in your ability to survive. And the things that granted your survival in the Stone Age were food, shelter, water, and community. And while those things may have no monetary value, in the Stone Age, being alive is a lot better than being dead with a pile of money. If you were rich in the Stone Age, you had a strong tribe around you. Your group consisted of strong, successful, ferocious hunters, attentive and expert gatherers, and passionate mothers taking care of the young. Humans in the Stone Age needed each other to survive, mainly because every aspect of life was work, and you can't do everything all by yourself. But in a tribe, tasks can be done by multiple people, allowing the group to survive. But outside of just tasks, the group also provided protection from natural predators, because in the Stone Age, humans weren't at the top of the food chain, and there was very much so natural predators that were wanting to eat you. But of course, community isn't the only thing that gave you wealth. Besides having this strong, tight-knit tribe, you also ensure that your tribe is located in a fruitful area of land. And what I mean by this is that hunting is bountiful. Animals consistently graze near your tribe, making hunting easy and consistent. But beyond just having a good location with consistent food and pelts, it's important that you have access to water, which is why you and your very wealthy tribe also have a perfectly clean stream going right beside your tribe's location. This stream provides your tribe not only with water, but also fish and transportation. But even with all of these Stone Age luxuries, there is still one more way that your tribe could have more wealth, and that is by having the best shelter possible. And in the Stone Age, one of the best options was a natural formation, typically a cave that provided shelter from storms and hot weather, consistent moderate temperatures, and once again, protection from natural predators. And while the bar may seem relatively low for the Stone Age, everything I just described was literally a dream come true. And if you happen to have all of these in your life, you were by far the wealthiest person to live. And by wealthiest, I just mean you were alive, because poverty in the Stone Age was literally just death. So even though our caveman ancestors didn't have much, and we can't verify who was the richest person at the time, it's at least interesting to understand what made a wealthy life during this time period, and it's also a good reminder that life is a blessing. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James, the Bronze Age, the time period that comes after the Stone Age. And luckily for us, we have verifiable evidence of who the richest person was during this time period. Wealth in the Bronze Age already looks worlds different than it did in the Stone Age. And that's because during the Bronze Age, human societal development really hit an exponential curve. And while the Stone Age literally went on for millions of years and only really yielded rudimentary structures and stone tools, the Bronze Age is where we really see society develop into small villages and also forging with metals. Most notably in this time period, bronze. With the development of society, culture, and tools, we now have a new definition of wealth. And fortunately, we also have documented history. However, I am using that term lightly because although we do have some texts referring to the reign and wealth of King Solomon, many of them came many years after his lifetime. So take some of these testimonies with a grain of salt. The year is 970 BC, and the Kingdom of Israel is now under new management. King Solomon was the successor to his father, King David. It's estimated that King Solomon's rule ran from 970 BC to 931 BC. An impressive 39 years. And keep in mind, during this time period, even living to see 39 was an accomplishment. But longevity is not the point of this video, and what's even more impressive than his reign was his wealth. It's recorded that under the reign of King Solomon, his kingdom actually earned its highest splendor and wealth of all time, with record revenues reaching 666 talents of gold in a single year, which is an ironic number, but that equates to over 18,125 kilograms of gold earned in a single year. Keep in mind, the reason reason we're talking in precious metal volumes and not, well, dollar values is because during this time, money didn't even exist, not even any form of coinage. Precious metals were truly the only store of value, meaning that gold was truly the gold standard. And for that reason, King Solomon got a lot of it. And how he got this gold may not be so much of a shock. As the king of a nation, Solomon's wealth primarily came through tax revenue. But on top of this massive tax revenue, he also earned money through trade alliances and also control over important trade routes that linked Africa, Asia, and Europe together. But like any good business mogul, he didn't end there. Solomon was also involved in mining, agriculture, and also building projects funded by the kingdom's resources itself, meaning that not only did he have a massive personal net worth, but he also had, well, basically infinite money at his expense through the wealth of the nation that he managed. And because of the prosperity that Solomon's kingdom saw during his long reign, it's estimated that King Solomon's net worth would be valued at anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion, which is insane. And since it's kind of variable, let's just average it at 2.5 trillion. Now, like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the information available about Solomon came from the Bible, which isn't an issue until you realize that Solomon lived and died hundreds of years before the Bible took place, essentially. So once again, for that reason, take this one with a grain of salt, but it's definitely an interesting first entry. And while we're on the topic of the Bible and interesting, not only did the Bible mention how wealthy King Solomon was, but they also mentioned how, well, promiscuous he was. And it's literally stated in the Bible that King Solomon had over 700 wives, and because that wasn't enough, he also had an additional 300 concubines, meaning that this dude literally not only had trillions of dollars, but also had 1,000 girls in his roster. The Iron Age. Interestingly, the Iron Age is not much different than the Bronze Age, and the brief period transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was actually a pretty tumultuous time. And while that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, society essentially took 2 steps forward in the Bronze Age, and then 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again into the Iron Age. And while once humanity sort of stabilized again within the Iron Age, it didn't look too different from the Bronze Age besides one key difference: the main metal at play, obviously being iron. But beyond the introduction of iron, we also see refinements and growth within the civilizations that were formed in the Bronze Age, or at least the ones that survived it. Consider that subtle foreshadowing. Now, once again, one of the richest people to ever exist, and most likely one of the richest people in all of the Iron Age, was a man known as King Croesus. And Croesus was the king of Lydia, a wealthy kingdom that existed in modern-day Turkey. Croesus had a relatively short reign, only reigning from 560 BC to 546 BC, roughly 14 years. But during this time, Croesus became an icon of wealth. And he was so rich, in fact, that the phrase, "as rich as Croesus," actually not only gained steam during his reign, but also existed for millennia after his death. But the story of Croesus and Lydia isn't all sunshine and rainbows, because although he did have immense wealth, his reign and life did eventually end up being cut short. But before we describe that, how exactly did he earn all this wealth? As a king, it may come as no surprise that Croesus' wealth was primarily earned through taxation, trade routes, and natural resources within the Kingdom of Lydia. Interestingly, in the Kingdom of Lydia, there was literally a river that was full of something known as electrum, which was essentially a naturally occurring alloy of silver and gold, which is pretty fortunate. But not only was Croesus known for being rich, but he also changed money forever. He actually started minting some of the world's first coins ever, standardizing the world's first gold and silver coins. And he did this so he could A, centralize his wealth, and B, strengthen the economy of his entire kingdom. And his idea of forming precious metal coins took off and spread across, eventually, the entire world. But as I mentioned, the story of Croesus is one of large wealth, but also one of large hubris. And it's claimed in ancient texts that it was the hubris of Croesus that led to his and his kingdom's eventual downfall. During Croesus' peak, the Kingdom of Lydia was rich, expanding, and even had alliances with Greek city-states. And Croesus himself was synonymous with wealth and power. And it's believed that because of all of this success and power, Croesus got a bit too confident, and this confidence caused him to challenge Cyrus the Great of Persia, Persia being another opposing empire at the time. Croesus felt confident that he could expand his empire and take on Persia, but first he made sure to contact an oracle, and it's written that this oracle that Croesus consulted prophesied that, quote, Croesus would destroy a great empire. And it's believed that Croesus interpreted this message as he had already won the war, so he could begin it and win with ease. Although the opposite was true, and the empire that Croesus would destroy was actually his own. And in 546 BC, Lydia fell to Persia, and it's believed that Croesus was either executed or spared and turned into an advisor for Cyrus. At the peak of his net worth, it's estimated that Croesus had roughly a net worth of $500 billion. which, I mean, compared to the previous trillionaire, doesn't sound that much, but this net worth is still insanely impressive. And remember, like King Solomon, this wealth was not stored in cash, stocks, crypto. This money was in physical gold and silver. And dude had so much money and so much time that he literally decided to create coinage. I bet King Solomon would have created coinage too if he wasn't messing around with 1,000 women. The classical era. The classical era is where things begin to get really interesting because history is getting more and more documented and wealth is becoming more and more, well, common. That being said, when I had to choose one rich person to represent the classical era, the option was obvious, and it started with me thinking about one of the most iconic empires that existed during the classical era, that being the Roman Empire. And when you think of Roman Empire, who do you think of? Julius Caesar wouldn't have been a wrong answer. But believe it or not, Julius Caesar wasn't actually the richest Roman. However, who is regarded as one of the richest, if not the richest Roman, was his adopted son, Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar was getting that bag. Augustus Caesar was born in 63 BC. And after winning probably the biggest lottery in all of human history, he was adopted by Julius Caesar, the infamous dictator of Rome at the time. Augustus was brought up surrounded by wealth, power, influence, and strategy, and truly learned the ropes from one of the most iconic people to ever live. That being said, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, there was a massive power vacuum, and Augustus had some major shoes to fill. However, he did exactly that. And not only did he rise to power through political skill, but he also formed strategic alliances and had numerous military victories under his belt. And because of this, at the relatively young age of only 36, Augustus Caesar actually officially formed the Roman Empire. If you're a fan of the channel, then you know that we've talked about the Roman Empire at length through our almost 100 videos. And ironically, my second video ever was actually a video about why the Roman Empire fell. And while that's outside the scope of the video, I thought I would mention it, because the Roman Empire has way more lore than I can summarize right now. Let's focus back in on Augustus. Following suit with other kings and leaders we've discussed so far, Augustus accumulated his massive wealth through the major expansion of the Roman territory, massive conquests, and the spoils of war. On top of this, having one of the strongest empires allowed him to have a steady stream of taxation, provincial revenues, and even tributes from conquered land. And conquer land he did. Augustus' fortune was tied to the control of land across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, which obviously just was the Roman Empire, but it's crazy to think the sheer scale of this entire place that he controlled. And interestingly, historians estimate that in today's money, the net worth of Augustus would be in the trillions of dollars, likely in the 3 to 4 trillion range. But this is largely because as the emperor of the Roman Empire, he essentially controlled and owned everything within it. Like, just imagine you're working at an Amazon warehouse and Jeff Bezos walks in and just starts taking stuff off the shelves. I mean, nobody's gonna stop him, and technically it's his, but at the same time, it's also the company's, and the lines really start to get blurred. Regardless, Augustus Caesar had an insane career, both politically and economically. And for that reason, he's not only remembered as the founder of the Roman Empire, the son of Julius Caesar, but also as one of the richest men to ever live, with a net worth of, let's say, $3 trillion. The medieval era. History is really heating up with the medieval era, and we are once again getting more and more interesting entries to this list and more data to verify some of these claims. That being said, we are still in the realm of estimation. Although in the medieval era, we have some very interesting estimates to discuss. And I want to start our medieval journey not in medieval Europe, but actually in the steppes of Mongolia. In the year 1162, a young boy named Temujin was born, and little did his family know Temujin would become one of the most famous and prolific people to ever live. And while this boy was named Temujin, you likely know him better as Genghis Khan. The same Genghis Khan that founded the Mongol Empire, which was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And the wealth of Genghis Khan is actually quite different from the others we've discussed so far, and the others that we're going to discuss as well. Quite frankly, being the founder and ruler of one of the largest empires to ever exist, there is a very likely chance that Genghis Khan could have been the richest person in all of human history. However, there's a very important asterisk on that point. Genghis Khan was not one for personal wealth. And while the empire he was the sole heir to was extremely prosperous and rich in both land, resources, livestock, food, and army, Genghis himself did not store much value. He rather decided to invest back into the army to continue the expansion of the Mongolian Empire, which is likely a major contributing factor why the Mongolian Empire was so unstoppable for so long. Genghis ate, slept, lived, and dressed like a majority of his army. And while the actions done by Genghis Khan are, for the most part, deplorable, and the majority of his entire empire was funded by the pillaging and destruction of any other civilization they could, find essentially, it is still somewhat noble that Genghis decided to remain close to his modest roots and invest the wealth that his empire brought him back into his empire to further expand it. And while estimates for Genghis Khan's net worth range from anywhere from a few trillion to over 100 trillion, I would say that Genghis Khan's net worth is almost negligible considering how he viewed money. But because we need a number on this list, let's just call it 100 trillion in access, but maybe 100 billion in execution. Money he actually spent on his own personal lifestyle. And honestly, I think even that's a bit overinflated. The Mongolian people were extremely nomadic, meaning that storing wealth was not necessarily a convenient thing to do. And unless you're Steve from Minecraft, you probably can't store $100 trillion worth of gold in your back pocket. Since Genghis Khan was relatively a modest individual, even though he was likely one of the most powerful people to ever live, I wanted to add a secondary entry for the medieval era, someone you'll likely recognize if you're familiar with ancient, wealthy people. This next individual is a man known as Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa, in many regards, is considered to be the most wealthy person to ever exist ever. Full stop. And while there's definitely an argument to back up that claim, we'll discuss how accurate that is at the end of the video. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire from roughly 1312 AD to 1337 AD. And under the power of Mansa Musa, Mali was able to reach its peak power, influence, and wealth, controlling almost every key trade route across West Africa. But more notably, Musa's wealth came from the control of trade of salt and gold, which were extremely prevalent in West Africa at the time. But he didn't just profit off the trade of salt and gold. He also profited off the trade of ivory, slaves, spices, and other goods. Or should I say bads, because I don't think calling slaves goods is, well, good. He profited off goods and bads, okay? Regardless, Musa's net worth was immense, and it only grew when he took his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. It was this pilgrimage that not only grew his net worth, but also increased his international fame. Musa traveled with a massive 60,000 person entourage, and he did so because he needed many people to carry all of the gold that he was earning and traveling with. And because he was traveling with so much gold, he would actually just give it away at different cities he was stopping in. And because of this, in cities like Cairo in Egypt, the gold that Musa was just giving away for free actually disrupted local economies. But yeah, Musa was literally kitted out in full gold armor, all gold tools, had an army of 60,000 people in all gold armor, an additional 60,000 camels with all gold armor, an inventory full of gold blocks. This guy made Mr. T's neck look naked, but at least he was generous. So generous, in fact, that he literally caused inflation. But here's where things get interesting. While every number we've discussed is an estimate, the estimate for Mansa Musa is relatively modest, with a net worth believed to be roughly around $400 billion, which is still massive and more money than the richest person in 2025 has. Although it's nowhere near the trillions we've discussed before. And after doing some research, I almost feel like Mansa Musa is known as the richest person to ever live simply because he was talked about so much in ancient texts, because this guy was just a G. If you saw a dude in all gold with 60,000 other gold people just giving out gold, I would probably believe that was the richest guy ever too. But that's not to discredit his legacy. The early modern era. Once again, there's so many good entries for this time period, we're doing a double feature. And we're starting with a man named Jacob Fugger. And Jacob Fugger is a real Fugger indeed. And that's because this man got so rich that he actually had more power over the kings in Europe. And that is saying something. Jacob Fugger was born into a wealthy family and started his career in the textile industry that his family was deeply invested in. Although it didn't take time for Jacob to realize that there was higher leverage opportunities out there. And he shifted his focus from being a merchant to being a bank for merchants. And with that, he made a massive fortune. And with that fortune, he got into some very interesting situations, specifically funding politicians to have power in parliament, and also by expanding his mining operation to create essentially a monopoly over the copper market in Europe. Jacob Fugger had so much money that he was literally known as Jacob Fugger the Rich. But he wasn't only known as a businessman. Like I mentioned, his career in politics made him known as a kingmaker, because he was giving out massive loans to Maximilian I and Charles V, both of which who ended up becoming massively powerful people within Europe. But Fugger wasn't only funding kings, he literally financed the creation of the Vatican. And to bankroll the construction of the Vatican, he actually started minting his own coins known as papal coins. And it was actually with Fugger's involvement with the Vatican that led to the eventual sale of indulgences, which was literally a ticket to heaven, which eventually sparked the entire Protestant Reformation. Regardless, Jacob Fugger was a very rich man. From textiles to mining to banker, Fugger did it all. And while he didn't do it all ethically, he did it. And it's estimated that his personal net worth was roughly 2% of Europe's GDP at the time, which would equate to roughly $400 billion in today's money. And interestingly, Jacob Fugger's net worth is one of the most provable net worths we've discussed so far, considering there are many records to validate these claims that are publicly available and, well, still exist. So even though 400 billion doesn't sound super impressive at this point in time, the power that he held as a non-royal was insane. And his net worth is likely one of the most accurate and non-inflated we've discussed so far. But like I mentioned, we got a double feature, so let's get that Fugger out of the way and discuss Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great was the third emperor of the Mughal Empire in India, and he ruled this empire from 1556 until his death in 1605. Interestingly, Akbar gained access to the throne at only 13 years old, when his father tragically died. And while giving a 13-year-old reign over an entire empire sounds like a horrible idea and has been proven to be multiple times throughout history, for Akbar, it actually worked out. It's almost like being a child actor. In most cases, it works out horribly, but sometimes it actually kind of does work out. His reign is remembered for vast land expansion, the flourishing of Indian culture, and strong central governance, which was largely missing at the time. And it was these primary contributing factors that made the Mughal Empire one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the early modern era. The wealth that Akbar generated for the Mughal Empire was actually primarily driven by agriculture, as the lands of northern India were extremely fertile. But of course, in addition to this agriculture, he also made most of his money from taxation, both taxing those crops and other goods. On top of agriculture and taxation, once again, control of trade routes was a steady stream of income that allowed the Mughal Empire to grow and flourish. And due to this political success and economic growth, he ended up making the empire extremely rich, like 25% of the entire world's GDP rich, which equates to roughly $30 trillion in today's money. And unlike Genghis Khan, Akbar knew how to spend some money. He was known for his opulence, and so were his courtrooms and official government buildings. I wanted to add these two examples specifically for the early modern era because the examples are so vastly different, both in how they started their lives, acquired their wealth, and obviously the shocking difference in net worth between these two individuals. But keep in mind, for Akbar specifically, this 25% of global GDP is the wealth of the empire he controlled, not his personal wealth. And while that line was relatively blurred, even if we say he conservatively only paid himself 10% of that, we can estimate that his personal net worth was roughly around 3 trillion, although he had access to up to 30 trillion. So I'll let you be the judge of that. The modern era. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it to the time period that we are currently existing in. With that being said, the modern era is considered to be from 1800 to today, meaning that we have a lot of ground to cover and many notable and documented individuals to discuss. So for that reason, I'm going to make this last time period a bit of a speed round. I want to first discuss Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who lived from 1794 to 1877, and he was a man who was known as the first American business tycoon. And that he was. Vanderbilt built his fortune primarily through shipping routes and railroads, and he started his career as a ferry operator in the New York City harbor, where he was first exposed to commercial transportation, which later inspired him to start his focus on railroads and expansion across all of America. That being said, Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily a good guy, and he actually earned the name of robber baron as well, because he would typically use monopolistic strategies and market manipulation in his favor to buy railroads as cheaply as possible and extract the most value out of them. Regardless, Vanderbilt is known as one of the men that built America as we know it today, and the railroad systems that he established connecting U.S. cities and boosting American trade are still marveled at to this very day. At the time of his death, Vanderbilt's net worth was roughly $3 billion in today's money. And interestingly, when he died, he was worth more than the US Treasury. So even though $3 billion sounds puny in the video, within context, that number is massive. Cornelius died in 1877, and interestingly, in 1973, only 100 years later, it was found out that during a family reunion, there was not one single millionaire left in the family. That's right, the Vanderbilt family literally blew billions of dollars in less than 100 years through financial mismanagement and I'm sure other reasons. And besides Cornelius, another major player during the beginning of the modern era was a man known as John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, he did. Rockefeller was one of the most prolific industrialists in American history, and he was the founder of the Standard Oil Company during the Industrial Revolution, a time when oil was an emerging market. And he was not only capitalizing on it, he was monopolizing on it. I think it's also important to note that during this time, business was nowhere near what it's like today. Like if you're complaining about modern day capitalism, then you should have seen 1800s capitalism. There was absolutely no regard for the environment, other business people, families, children, nothing. The Industrial Revolution was full of factories that had pregnant women and children working all day, with reckless disposal of industrial waste, and the most strong-arm, backstabby business tactics you've literally ever heard of. 1800s Industrial Revolution business was not for the faint of heart. And fortunately for Rockefeller, this was a game he was willing to play. When Rockefeller launched Standard Oil in 18 1870, he grew the company rapidly by essentially undercutting all of his competition. And then with the revenue he gained through undercutting this competition, he then bought out all of his competitors. And only 2 years after starting Standard Oil in 1872, there was a small few-month streak where Rockefeller bought 22 of the 26 oil refineries in Cleveland alone. And this purchasing streak was so impactful on Cleveland that it was literally known as the Cleveland Massacre. But Rockefeller didn't just undercut and buy every oil refinery he could. He also made sure to integrate vertically, controlling everything from the production, transportation, and sales of any oil product. And during the late 1870s, Standard Oil was literally refining over 90% of America's oil. And eventually, people were fed up with it. And I think in some cases, Rockefeller was truly seen as the first real example of true corporate greed, a symbol and theme that would continue until, well, today. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, got so big, in fact, that in 1911, the Supreme Court forced him to break up his company into 34 smaller companies, which he did, and ironically, this division only led to an increase of net worth for Rockefeller. Rockefeller was not a good guy, but there are a lot of things we use every single day that have been influenced from his work, and it was people like him that built the society we live in today, whether you like it or not. Rockefeller's net worth was estimated to be equivalent to almost 2% of all of the US's GDP, and he's also considered to be the world's first billionaire. And while there's definitely other honorable mentions from the beginning part of the modern era, like the Rothschilds and Henry Ford, I want to fast forward to the modern day to discuss some of the richest people in 2025, and also reflect on all of the rich people we've discussed and determine who is the richest of all. As of today, the world's richest man is largely believed to be Elon Musk. But besides Elon Musk, some other notable billionaires include Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, and Bernard Arnault. And while I think most of us understand who these people are and how they made their money, I think it's important to reflect on how their net worths differ from people in the past. For example, you don't see Elon Musk storing all of his net worth in gold or taking a 60,000 person pilgrimage across Africa with gold armor on. A majority of his wealth is in shares, stocks, and is largely based off of the evaluation of the companies that he owns. Now, if we stack up Elon Musk's net worth of roughly $382 billion at the time of recording this video, he actually ranks relatively low in the context of this list. And for that reason, this video is about to get rather subjective, because to answer the question of who's the richest person in human history, there's a few different answers, at least in my opinion. If you want to base the ranking of history's richest person based off the numerical value, which, I mean, is logical, then I would say that honestly Genghis Khan has an extremely strong case for richest person ever. Although, if you want to base it off popular vote, there is a lot of people, for good reason, that believe that Mansa Musa was the richest person to ever walk this earth. However, if you're asking me who the richest person in all of human history is, genuinely, I would say that there has to be more factors beyond just wealth we consider. Because while Genghis Khan may have potentially had the most access to wealth, he personally wasn't extremely wealthy and also lived a lifestyle I have absolutely no interest in. And to be frank, I really don't have much interest in living any time before, I guess, 1990. The reason being, maybe I'm just spoiled, but I enjoy modern luxuries of today. And I would argue that somebody with a minimum wage job in America today lives a much better life than a king did in medieval times. Specifically because the technology, medicine, entertainment, and modern luxuries far outweigh any amount of gold, at least in my opinion. And I guess you have to ask yourself, do you want to be in a castle with a jester and a pile of unlimited gold? Or do you want a toilet that flushes, air conditioning, and access to YouTube to watch Trust Me Bro? That's the question. I'll let you decide in the comments. But if you're asking me who I think the richest person in all of human history is, I would definitely argue that Elon Musk takes the cake. Simply because his net worth is massive, he's the most prosperous man in the most prosperous era of human history, and he's also able to enjoy his money during the best time to ever live in human history, which is today, in my opinion. The craziest battles in human history. No, not epic rap battles of history, the craziest battles of history. In this video, I'm going to discuss battles that were crazy and undoubtedly had an impact on history. Let's get started. The year is 1204 AD. You are an ambitious leader with the sole goal of unifying all of Mongolia under a single banner, bringing together all of the nomadic tribes into one mega civilization, something that has never been done before. Your life has not been easy. Since birth, your life has been a cycle of life and death, with almost everybody you know being involved in battle and dying. This brutal lifestyle was relatively normal for the tribes living in the Mongolian steppe, although it doesn't make it any easier. Through focus and sheer dedication, you have become an extremely powerful leader, and you are close to achieving your goal of unifying all of Mongolia, with now only one obstacle standing in your way. Another great Mongolian warrior named Jamaka, a leader who holds almost opposite values to yours, with the goal of preserving tradition and keeping historic practices alive, specifically focusing on family ties. This opposing leader was also one of your childhood best friends, and someone you considered to be a blood brother, someone who brought stability and joy to your life. someone who unfortunately over the years you had grown apart from due to ideological differences. And now this battle in which you are about to embark on is the conclusion of your long brewing rivalry, and will solidify a massive change not only in the history of Mongolia, but also in the history of the world. Today is the day you find yourself standing in a battlefield. You and your army are slowly approaching a much larger army, an army that is led by Jemaka. It's hard to not feel confident when you have an army of 66,000 trained warriors. However, when your enemy outnumbers you by multiples, you need to get creative. While your army begins to approach the army of the enemy, you signal your army to spread out as wide as possible, not only to make your army appear larger than it is, but also to subconsciously encourage the enemy army to do the exact same. As the armies approach closer and closer, you have two extremely long lines of warriors headed directly at each other. And all of a sudden, you signal your entire army with the blow of a horn, a signal you taught them months prior. And at that point, your army collapses from a long army into a narrow, almost arrow formation penetrating the enemy line. This strategy was extremely effective and almost instantly shattered any strategy that Jemaka's army had, and now they are clueless in trying to pick up the pieces. During this bloodshed and confusion, the leaders of the opposing force, including Jemaka, fled, leaving their soldiers essentially abandoned. And it was at this point when you and your army killed who you had to and capture all who were willing to submit. As the sun sets and the dust settles, you reflect on the epic battle that you just embarked on, now with an army that is double the size that you started with. And due to this battle, you are well on your way to unifying the Mongolian people, the goal that started this entire battle in the beginning. And this long-lasting feud with Jemaka, your ex-childhood best friend and current arch-nemesis. The outcome of this battle and unified people led to a seemingly unstoppable army, and the victor of the Battle of the 13 Sides. And what you and your army would go on to achieve would become known as the largest contiguous army in all of human history. And you, who formerly would be known as Temujin, would go on to solidify your name as Genghis Khan. For me, this battle is crazy for a lot of reasons. Not only is it the story of a modest army literally dividing and conquering a much larger army, but it also is essentially the origin story of Genghis Khan, at least as we know him today. Obviously, his younger self, Temujin, has a super interesting and long backstory as well, but that's beyond the scope of this video, specifically about epic battles. And with the birth of Genghis Khan and this new unified Mongolia, we also see the birth of the Mongolian Empire, which, like I mentioned, is the largest contiguous empire in all of history. At its peak, the Mongol Empire ruled over 23.5 million square kilometers of land, or just under 10 million square miles of land, which is insane. Starting with just one man from humble beginnings in the foothills of Mongolia to conquering almost all of Asia and even parts of Europe and the Middle East. For better or for worse, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire was a force to be reckoned with. And the Battle of the 13 Sides was definitely a catalyst for everything that the Mongol Empire was able to achieve. Oh, and in case you were curious, Jemaka, who was able to flee this battle, was later captured and executed. So yeah, not only did fleeing not save his life, it also very likely lost him the battle. This was a pretty crazy battle with some pretty crazy implications, but we're only just getting started. Let's move over a bit west and go a little bit further back in time to discuss an army that was extremely outnumbered and a battle that was fought by an extremely iconic leader, someone you're definitely gonna recognize. Let's dive right in. The year is 331 BC, and you are standing in Gaugamela, which today is known as Iraq. And you are a great leader from Macedon, an ancient Greek kingdom. And while living over 2,000 years ago, your name still inspires fear to whoever hears it. Your name is Alexander the Great, and you are fighting a seemingly impossible battle. You have an army of 47,000 experienced and trained soldiers, but standing against you in this battlefield is the army of Darius III, the Persian king of kings, and his army of 200,000 dwarfs your skilled yet small army. It is believed that a majority of this large army is essentially underskilled. However, there is strength in numbers, and there is still a good amount of extremely well-trained soldiers included in this massive army fighting for the Persians. This isn't the first time that you, Alexander the Great, are fighting Darius III. However, this battle that we are about to begin is likely the craziest and most important. Previous to this war, you were already campaigning in the Persians' territory to conquer Persia, and obviously Darius was unhappy about this. But with your unwavering dedication to conquer the Persian land, it was only a matter of time until this battle between you and Darius took place. The last battle that you had with Darius 2 years prior, you were victorious in, although Darius was able to escape. And that is something that you're unsatisfied with. And due to the massive size of the Persian Empire, over that 2-year span, Darius was able to reclaim and rebuild an entirely new army, which is is exactly who you are fighting today. The battle begins, and the Persian army sends hundreds of chariots directly at your infantry units. The light infantry units were able to bombard the Persian chariots with bows and arrows, slowing them down and weakening their numbers, to the point that when the chariots approached the units further back in your army, they were already significantly damaged. Interestingly, the chariots that were able to survive were able to not only approach your army, but also pass your army and get behind them. But instead of exploiting this vulnerable position that they had just exposed, they instead decided to make a run to your base camp to loot it, which was definitely short-sighted because this led the army much weaker than it needed to be. Like, just imagine you're standing there, you see horses and chariots essentially rushing your position, and as you're huddled there behind your sword and shield, all you hear is the horse running at you and then running by you. And then you turn around and look and you see that they're still going and still going. Now that the Persians' front line was distracted and essentially gone, their army's lack of experience was exposed, and so was their king. And it was at that point when you and your army go for the kill. You and your top soldiers approach King Darius directly, head on. And as you slaughter his army to get closer and closer to him, you notice that he not only steps back, but begins to retreat. Now, unfortunately, as much as you likely wanted to chase him down and execute him yourself, you simply weren't able to, and it was not strategic. However, the retreat of the Persian king led to a mass retreat of the Persian army, completely eliminating their number advantage. Of course, you still had work to do eliminating the soldiers that were able to get past your defenses initially, but at this point, your victory was already secured. With King Darius III nowhere to be found, and the majority of the army eliminated or also on the run, you now had free reign to achieve your goal of conquering the Persian Empire, after ending up victorious in the Battle of Gaugamela. The one battle that ended the Persian Empire. A battle that undoubtedly had a large impact on human history, as Alexander was able to go on and spread Greek ideals and culture across the, at that point, known world. It just makes you think, what if Alexander the Great had lost that battle? I knew I had to put these two stories next to each other just because of, at least to me, the similarities that they had. First of all, being the underdog story, having a much smaller army but still coming out victorious. Secondly, both of these battles involving iconic historic leaders, for better or for worse. And the fact that both of these battles ended in a significant impact on the course of history. Alexander the Great and King Darius definitely weren't childhood best friends, but during this battle, they were definitely mortal enemies. And if you look into some of the other battles that they had previously, it'd be pretty obvious to know why. A small example would be the previous battle they had before this battle of Gargamel, known as the Battle of Isius, ended with a loss for King Darius, but also the capture of his wife, his mother, and his two daughters, and the control of southern Asia, specifically modern-day Turkey. So yeah, for the Battle of Gargamel, King Darius was definitely coming back for blood, and I think that's kind of shown by the army of literally over 200,000 soldiers, at least estimated. But yeah, I just find this battle so crazy, and despite being heavily outnumbered, the army of the Macedon emerged victorious due to its obviously superior tactics and pretty clever use of its troops. Whether this was good or bad, I have no input on. I'm referencing these from a historical matter. That being said, let's move on to our next battle. The year is 202 BC. You are currently the most popular living man in Rome, and after campaigning in Spain and coming back to Rome, you, while technically ineligible, become the governor of Sicily, which is a huge deal. And you are at the tail end of the Second Punic War, a war between two extremely powerful ancient civilizations, Rome and Carthage. Carthage was a city in North Africa, and they were inspired by Rome and wanted to control trade and land, just like Rome did. The most famous person from Carthage was a man named Hannibal, who led an army of over 40,000 men and literal war elephants from Spain all the way into Italy, going through the Alps, which alone is an insane feat, but that's really only where it begins. After this deadly voyage, they were able to essentially sneak attack the Romans and win some pretty significant battles, like the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal and his army was able to occupy a small part of Italy for almost 16 years, and definitely annoying, but not necessarily damaging Rome itself. So the Romans didn't put their full effort into destroying Hannibal just yet. That's where you come in. Your name is Scipio Africanus. You wanted to put an end to this Hannibal guy once and for all. And while the higher government really wasn't willing to support you in terms of troops, your fame and popularity was able to gather you a large army of volunteers. From these volunteer campaigns, you were able to gather over 7,000 pretty qualified soldiers, many of which were veterans who fought against Hannibal in the Italian countryside and was also fed up with his shenanigans, to say the least. This is where the battle we are about to discuss begins. A battle known as the Battle of Zama. The battle begins with this modest army invading North Africa. With with the intention of drawing Hannibal back out of Rome and into Carthage, which was a success. Once Hannibal had returned, he had put together an army that I could only describe as terrifying. Your plan worked perfectly, and Hannibal returned. Unfortunately, he returned with a vengeance and began to put together an army that you couldn't even begin to imagine. The front line of this army that you're about to engage consisted of war elephants, literally an entire line of war elephants. Behind these roughly 80 war elephants stood roughly 4,000 cavalry and 36,000 infantry units, a massive army to say the least. However, you didn't come unprepared either. You, once again, had a modest army, at least comparatively, but you weren't completely outnumbered. Your army consisted of around 24,000 infantry units and 6,000 cavalry units. The battle began from the Carthage side, and you notice a group of war elephants running from the front line, and they're not necessarily running directly at you. They're running in your direction, but slowly turning and turning until they actually run back into their own army. And this is the beginning of the end. It begins to cause a massive disruption within the Carthage army. You instantly command part of your army to take advantage of this huge distraction and begin to attack their vulnerable army that is currently being trampled by their own elephants. It was at this point where you see the other elements from the enemy front line begin running at your army, and this is something you had planned for. These elephants approach your army, but don't run directly into your army. They run into the gaps that your army had made for them, where at that point your army was able to attack and neutralize these battle elephants, which were essentially used as early versions of tanks or battering rams at the very least. After this, it was a face-off of the cavalry, and the Carthaginian and the Roman cavalry met in the center of the battlefield and resulted in a retreat of Hannibal's and your cavalry chasing directly behind them, leaving only the infantry units behind. Left on the battlefield is your 23,000 troops versus Hannibal's 36,000, and you're on enemy turf. The infantry battle was intense and resulted in your first line of men essentially holding off the first line of the enemy troops until there was an opening for your men to begin the battle. However, as your first two lines of defense were able to essentially eliminate the first two lines of the Carthaginian defense, you now have one line of men that are injured and tired at best. And Hannibal still has his final line of defense, which was his most experienced, most talented, and completely fresh army, which hadn't even lifted a finger yet in this entire battle. At this point, you begin to get extremely worried and question if it's even possible that you can win this battle. Sure, their first two lines of defense were eliminated, but now you have an extremely tired and injured army, and they have an untouched line of assassins essentially. So at this point, it doesn't matter that now the numbers have essentially been even, because their numbers were stronger than your numbers. It was at this point when you call your men to retreat and you reorganize them. You put all of your men into one line and put your weakest men in the middle and the strongest on the outside. There wasn't much opportunity for any real strategy or clever tricks. It was an all-out bloodbath, and your army fought Hannibal's army face-on, fighting brutally and neither army giving up an inch of space. Their men's obvious experience and lack of wounds was showing, and this battle was not looking good for Rome at all. And you, Scipio, were beginning to assume the worst, when all of a sudden you hear something in the distance that is about to change the course of history. Dashing directly at Hannibal's army from behind was your cavalry units, the same cavalry units that were essentially drawn away by their cavalry units. And they were coming to your rescue, as shortly after chasing their cavalry units, they realized that the point of their cavalry units retreating was to draw them out of the battlefield, to allow their more trained infantry to clean up the Roman army. Ironically, this sort of maneuver was something that Hannibal was known for, and it is a bit ironic that this is the maneuver that led to his downfall. It was at this point that Rome forced Carthage into peace and turned them essentially into a client state. After this war, Carthage had to give up all of its power, land, and resources to Rome, and this led Rome to become one of the most powerful forces in the region and in history ever. And this victory was also a huge step for Rome becoming the massive empire that we still discuss to this day. So yeah, congratulations on you and your men. But this story is undoubtedly crazy. It's wild to think that this battle is only one of many battles in the Punic Wars, and as much as I would love to talk about those, it really goes beyond the scope of this entire video. But if you guys are interested in a video on the craziest wars ever, then we could discuss that. But for the sake of this video, focusing on battles, let's focus back in on the Battle of Zama. I swear I didn't intend on this video being full of underdog stories, but don't be surprised if you're watching this video and the title is The Greatest Underdog Stories in Battle or something along those lines, because honestly, who doesn't love a good underdog story? This battle specifically has a lot of elements of fairy tale battles that just make it so cool. The unlikely leader that rose through the ranks and was able to essentially build his own militia outside of the government, his ambitious plan to take down an entire country, and the noble goal of defeating the person that has been more or less of a nuisance on their home turf for 16 years. That person being Hannibal in Italy, of course. Scipio was undoubtedly a badass, and I'm honestly surprised I haven't heard about him sooner, but I definitely enjoyed learning about his rise to power and this specific victorious battle, where he and Rome were victorious. I also love how part of this underdog story is literally the fact that Rome used Hannibal's war tactics against him once and for all. Like literally after this battle, Carthage was wiped off the face of the earth. But it does make you think though, what if Rome had lost this battle? What would have happened? Hannibal was already on Rome's territory, and they did have a relatively strong army. If Rome hadn't won this battle, there's a chance that we would have never had the Roman Empire. And if that was the case, the world that we live in today would be extremely different. Our language, culture, architecture, money, laws, and so many other things come directly from the Roman Empire. And with this battle potentially being the catalyst of the Roman Empire's success, I think it's safe to say that this battle definitely had an impact on history and that it was undoubtedly a crazy battle. If for no other reason than having war elephants, which is honestly badass. So that's at least 1 point for Hannibal. War elephants, that's pretty sick. Although, as cool as they were ultimately part of their downfall. But I digress. Before we move on to the last battle of this list, I want to make a quick point. Obviously, there is no possible way for me to include every crazy battle throughout history, and if you think that this list is missing an important battle, I'm right there with you. And I encourage you to please drop a comment below about your favorite battle and why you think it deserves a spot on the next list. I say next list because doing research for this video caused me to come up with a plethora of entries that I just couldn't fit on this list. However, if you guys are interested in another video about epic battles throughout history that changed history, please let me know in the comments by saying you want part 2 or even suggesting battles that you think I missed in this video. Now, let's discuss the final battle of this video. And for this last battle, let's go a bit more modern, at least comparatively to these other entries. A battle that is involved in a war that is of personal interest to myself, and I'm assuming many of you guys as well. The year is 1943, and you are a soldier for the Soviet Union, fighting under a man named Joseph Stalin, a person who is not a good person, but he's a better boss than the enemy you're fighting against. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. As a soldier in Stalingrad, you are informed that Germany is planning not only an attack, but a complete takeover of Stalingrad, and over 200,000 Soviet men were sent to slow Germany's advance. All 200,000 of those men died trying to slow Germany's advance. After hearing reports of those men losing their life and the German advance still heading your way, morale was beginning to slip. And before you could even think about what the next plan would be, you hear something from above. It's a German Luftwaffe, a fire attack dropping bombs all over Stalingrad, making a majority of the city rubble and dust. You and your remaining comrades brace for impact as you know that this is only the beginning of a battle, not the end. And soon, you see a German army advance on your position, a position that is extremely compromised. For months, the Germans essentially flooded the destroyed city to continue the battle, and this pile of rubble essentially went from a town to a meat grinder. With things beginning to look even more bleak, if that was even possible, the Soviets had one more trick up their sleeve, and the timing couldn't have been any better. It was a Soviet winter. It was also at this point when the Soviets had come up with the plan to not face the Germans head on, but to try to surround them, which they were successfully able to do, and you and your comrades were able to not only eliminate German soldiers, but circle them, closing them off from any sort of resupplies, which was extremely deadly, as now the Germans were standing in the rubble that they had created, surrounded by Soviets, with absolutely no way of gaining new supplies, or at this point, even intelligence. And with winter arriving, this German army, which was abandoned by Hitler, was left to essentially wither away. Many of these German soldiers froze to death or simply died due to starvation. After enough time had gone on where you and your troops believed that the Germans had to have been snuffed out, you and a group of comrades go to revisit Stalingrad one last time, preparing for a battle, but not sure what you were going to see. Walking through the rubble, you see only emaciated, dead German soldiers and realize that this was successful. And the Soviet victory of this battle was a huge landmark in the downfall of Nazi Germany. It wasn't the final nail in the coffin, but it was one of the first nails in the coffin, for sure. So yeah, not only was this battle extremely deadly, disgusting, and more brutal than we could probably ever even imagine, it's on this list for 2 reasons. 1, obviously because of the historical impact, and 2, because of the sheer numbers. The Battle of Stalingrad is not only one of the deadliest and biggest battles in World War II, but also one of the deadliest and biggest battles of all time. And for that reason, I definitely thought I would talk about it in this video. If you know anything about World War II, then you know that the Soviets paid a massive price for their efforts in World War II, in the form of tens of millions of their soldiers. And while their efforts were extremely helpful in defeating the Germans, it did come with that human cost. And this battle is a great example of that. Germans wanted Stalingrad so badly because it was a big industrial city, and it was a key to controlling that region, something that Germany was definitely interested in. Stalin obviously wanted to protect Stalingrad because it was an important city and also because it held his name, something that meant a lot to him. The Battle of Stalingrad was a huge turning point for the war. Not only did it stop Germany's advance into the Soviet Union, but it also gave the US and Britain more hope, which was much needed at this point. After this battle, the Germans began losing more and more, and the Soviets were even able to push them all the way back into Germany, a place that they had at that point expanded far out of. This battle is only a small glimpse into the sheer determination that the Soviet army had, even when fighting in terrible conditions, and how powerful it was in the ultimate destruction of Nazi-occupied Germany. What it was like to be rich throughout every era of history. The Stone Age. In the Stone Age, wealth was measured in terms of resources and survival capabilities almost solely. To be considered rich, one would need an abundance of essential resources, such as food, tools, and materials for shelter and clothing, which at the time primarily consisted of wood, animal pelts, organic materials such as large leaves, and essentially sticks and dirt. Possessing skills in hunting, gathering, and toolmaking would also be extremely valuable. On top of that, forming strong social bonds and alliances within one's tribe or community would enhance the access to resources and collective security. What this means is the more friends you had, the more people that you had to potentially help and protect you if things got wild, which back in the Stone Age, they did a lot. Accumulating and managing resources like animal hides for clothes, flint for tools, and a steady food supply through effective hunting and foraging were a key to thriving in this era, and was truly the key of becoming and staying rich or wealthy, which, if it isn't already obvious, just means to be alive. Your survival was your wealth, as that was all there was to look forward to. If you could survive another day and you had the resources to make it through that day successfully, you were well off. It goes without saying that there wasn't necessarily coinage in the Stone Age, at least not in the early Stone Age, and as far as the absolute origin of money, that is still something that is not fully known or understood. But during the Stone Age, possessing skills and having access to practical, life-enabling resources was the pinnacle of wealth. During the Stone Age, if you had a cozy cave that you could call your own, you had a few pelts to wrap around your naked, hairy, stinky body, you had basic flint and obsidian tools to catch little critters, and you had a good group of friends that you could eat rocks with, you were set. But not just set, you were also wealthy. Just picture it now. Not a phone in sight. Just you, all of your best boys wearing small loincloths, hitting each other over the head with big wooden clubs, just being in the moment. Sounds pretty good to me. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron's age, the Bronze Age. Not to be confused with LeBron James, I'm talking about the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age took place between 1330 BC and 1200 BC and signified a large leap in civilization for a few reasons, most notably the production of bronze. This era, while short compared to the Stone Age, which literally lasted millions of years, had significant technological advancements, which propelled society massively. If you're unfamiliar, all bronze is melted down tin with a larger amount of melted down copper. This alloy was easy to produce and readily available, and the production of this alloy and subsequently the tools made from it allowed for rapid development in both agriculture and warfare. With that being said, what did it look like to be rich, and how was wealth measured during the Bronze Age? During this time, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze. Being rich meant that you had access to these metal ores and the knowledge of crafting weapons, tools, and other ornaments. Trade became more prominent, so establishing strong trade networks and engaging in commerce was also a massive way to improve your wealth. These were some of the earliest economies ever. Additionally, owning agricultural land and livestock, which were crucial for food and trade, would signify wealth. Similar to the Stone Age, both of these are directly tied with life. Now, for almost the first time, social status was also playing a role with your wealth, with leaders often amassing wealth through tribe control over resources. So what exactly did it look like to be rich? Well, during the Bronze Age, we saw some of the earliest civilizations. So with that, we would see villages and larger communities living in one place. With that being said, if you were wealthy, you obviously had a nicer place or a larger place, or potentially in a prime piece of the community, closer to the water or the farm. Besides that, we also saw irrigation agriculture, which basically means bringing the water to your crops. So if you were wealthy at this time, your farm that you had control or access to had an irrigation system built into it for convenience. And similar to the Bronze Age, if you had a good, strong network of people that you could trade with and access to tools and knowledge on how to build tools, you were pretty well off. Just imagine you and all your friends wearing slightly more animal pelts in a bigger group of people with a nice farm and a slightly bigger mud hut made with actual wood and nicer materials. You guys are all sitting around the forge making bronze swords and whatnot. Seems like a cool time. In ancient Sumeria, during the Bronze Age, one of the earliest known currencies was actually grain. Grain was used as a popular method of trade. Besides grain, there has been some mysterious clay tokens that have been suspected to be used as a means of trade. And then, as the Bronze Age continues, silver becomes a very popular means of currency, and then later after that, gold as well. So without getting too far into the weeds, during the Bronze Era, if you had a lot of social status, access to both land, agriculture, and animals, if you had a prime plot of real estate, and you had a steady supply of bronze and you knew how to make good tools, you were really well off. And then on top of that, if you had a large supply of silver and gold, then you were rich. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is a bit of an interesting era because at this point you might think that it was simply caused out of pure evolution and innovation, and up until this point everything's just been linear progress, but that's actually not the case. And during the Bronze Age, at least near the very end of the Bronze Age, there was multiple significant factors happening that caused a huge decline in production, literacy, trade routes, wealth, and overall progress for humans as a whole. And the very end of the Bronze Era and the beginning of the Iron Age was actually considered more or less of a dark time in humanity. The Bronze Age was more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of deal. And with the beginning of the Iron Age, we see almost more or less of a redo of the Bronze Age, but obviously with a new metal. We have iron, a much more valuable and a much stronger material. Following the same trend, however, the Iron Age was shorter than the Bronze Age simply because technological advancements took place quicker and humans were able to evolve more rapidly, even after the setbacks. With that being said, being wealthy in the Iron Age wasn't much different than being wealthy in the Bronze Age, as a lot of the same customs and traditions existed and the same means of production and wealth accumulation were in play. In the Iron Age, wealth was closely tied to the possession and production of iron, similar to bronze in the Bronze Age. Mastery of ironworking techniques to create durable tools and weapons provided a significant advantage to anyone looking to become truly wealthy. Rich individuals or communities would control iron deposits and forges, facilitating trade with military strength, either from their own community or even other communities. Agricultural advancements continued to be important, so owning and controlling fertile land and livestock remained to be a very prominent sign of wealth. Power and influence were also consolidated through warfare and alliances, with wealthy individuals holding positions of authority and accumulating wealth through tribute and trade. The Iron Age still yet didn't have coinage, and a lot of wealth was held in gold nuggets, gold sheets, gold ornaments, gold jewelry, fertile land, livestock, access to iron production, and access to military power and influence. The Medieval Era, aka the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. This era took place immediately after the fall of the Roman Empire, beginning in 476 AD and lasted for roughly 1,000 years until 1400 AD. During this time, wealth had become a lot more multifaceted and also more centralized on your connection with the powers that be. Besides the king and other royalty, the richest members of society in medieval times were the nobility and merchants. The richest of merchants were those who engaged in long-distance trade, specifically of luxury goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals, all of which were extreme signs of wealth. And although the levels of wealth between nobles varied quite significantly, the richest of nobles were those that controlled the most amount of land and had the closest connections to the monarch. Regardless of noble or merchant, at the top of each of these levels, life was pretty similar. These individuals would have their own dedicated castles, fully staffed with servants. They would have large estates and farms that would be maintained by peasants and serfs. They would have luxury goods such as expensive dyes, luxurious silk clothing, expensive gold jewelry, and access to an almost unlimited supply of food and entertainment of many varieties, if you catch my drift. On top of this, the richest in society also had access to great education, something that was still a large rarity for a majority of the population. This includes reading, writing, literature, and access to other scholarly texts. Now, with this being said, if you were rich in this time period, you had an amazing opportunity to live a life of leisure and luxury. But although that wasn't the case for many people, and the wealth gap during the Middle Ages was severe. Now, with that being said, it wasn't all fine and dandy for the rich of this time, because no matter what your financial status was during this time, you were still susceptible to disease, famine, and war. Just picture it. You're hanging out with all your boys. You're in your castle with torches everywhere. Your servant just brought you a big leg of lamb, and you all are drinking out of gem-encrusted solid gold goblets. You all cheers and spill wine on your expensive silk shirts, but you don't even care because you're so rich. You have a guy in a silly hat come do a dance for you, and then you go to bed and do it all again the next day. Seems pretty cool to me. But let's move on. The early modern era. Bros, we are getting extremely close to the modern era, but we're not quite there yet. We are currently in the early modern era, which takes place roughly from 1500 AD to 1800 AD. And this era of time is likely one of the most influential eras when it comes to the structure of the world that we live in today. Let me explain. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants and bankers accumulated wealth through the large global trade trade of goods like spices, textiles, and precious metals. The rise of capitalism and establishment of joint stock companies allowed for the pooling of resources and the sharing of risks and rewards. Owning land and engaging in agriculture still continued to be important, but the growing influence of commerce, finance, and manufacturing marked a significant shift on how wealth was perceived and earned in the early modern day. Up until this point, all it really took to be rich was having a cow, having a little bit of dirt to your name, and maybe a few shekels. Well, not even shekels, literally just bits of silver and having the right friends. But as we got into the early modern era, a lot of things seemed to change. We saw early globalization, early capitalism, early colonization, and the basis for the society that we all live in today. This was a pretty influential and pretty important 300-year run, in my opinion. And with that being said, what did it look like to be rich in the early modern era? Well, honestly, a lot more of the same. Bigger houses, more loot, more money, more connections, more food, more entertainment, bigger boats, more security. The biggest difference was the means of accumulating these resources. And if you were the type of person to be going on these conquests or voyages, then your life was extremely hectic, spending months or even years at sea to potentially come home empty-handed or never even come home at all. People were just playing Assassin's Creed Black Flag in real life. With that being said, everything was just sunshine and rainbows, right? Definitely not, like at all. But we're talking about being rich, so yeah, being rich was pretty awesome almost all the time. And in the early modern era, we saw for almost the first time how being wealthy started to shift. The modern era. And just like that, in the last 11.5 minutes, we went from millions of years ago in the Stone Age to the modern day. Now, the modern era is kind of blended into the early modern era, so there's no exact start date, but for the sake of this video, we'll consider it from 1800 until present day. In the modern era, wealth has been increasingly associated with industrialization, innovation, and finance. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies, creating vast fortunes for those who owned factories, mines, and railways. In the contemporary world, wealth is often derived from investments in technology, real estate, and financial markets. Entrepreneurs and business owners who innovate and scale their business can achieve substantial wealth. Education and knowledge has become a critical asset, and advanced degrees and specialized skills open doors to lucrative careers. Globalization and digital technologies such as the internet have further expanded opportunities for wealth creation across diverse sectors and regions. I would say that the world we live in today is pretty great, and we enjoy a lot of modern luxuries, and we have so many amazing opportunities right at our fingertips. Never before has the world been so decentralized, meaning that anybody has the opportunity to do great things. Whereas in the past, if you were a serf or a peasant working on a noble's farm, you had almost zero chance of being anything more than that. With that being said, in the modern day, especially as in present day, the amount of opportunities of getting wealthy thanks to the internet is almost limitless. But even at the beginning of the modern era, near the Industrial Revolution, opportunities were starting to present themselves everywhere. And obviously we got off to a rough start with extreme amounts of child labor, including chimney sweeps, factory workers, and a lot of horrible stuff that definitely isn't great, but got a lot of people rich. With that being said, what does it look like to be rich in the modern day? Well, fortunately, I don't think I have to paint too much of a crazy picture for you guys. And honestly, I think in the modern day, wealth is really what you make of it. Because of the vast amount of opportunities, it can be whatever you want it to be. If you have enough money to sustain yourself, then your wealth could look like living in a van that you own and have enough money coming in on a monthly basis to maintain your lifestyle. Or it could look like the biggest mansion full of the craziest watches and cars and gold doubloons. Now, for a generalization, the rich of today typically enjoy compounding interest with their investments, a good portfolio of real estate, freedom of time by having tasks delegated through their employees, and freedom of location and time, meaning that they can work where they want, when they want. That is, if they want to. Now, one thing I will say, bros, is that I just tried to sum up millions of years of history in under 15 minutes, so if something doesn't sound fully right, just remember, trust me, bro.